Before we drift away, don't forget to like the video and subscribe for more calming sleep stories. Sweet dreams await. Part 1, The Rain That Followed. The first drops began before the forest had even come into view. The narrow road curved like a ribbon of fading gravel between rolling green hills, thick with early summer mist. With every step forward, the hum of insects faded and the wind softened. Trees began rising on either side, tall, dark, and ancient. A gray rain cloud, swollen and unmoving, hovered above it all like a warning held in suspension. The travelers' boots squelched as the first light rain came down in slow, even taps. No thunder. No wind. Just the measured rhythm of droplets brushing leaves, pooling in footprints, and running in thin silver lines down the bark of crooked trees. He stepped into the threshold of the forest, and the change was instant. The sounds of the world dimmed. The canopy swallowed the sky. What little light remained came filtered through deep moss and hanging vines, thick branches stretching like ribs above a stone-spined path. It wasn't the sort of forest drawn on maps anymore, this was older. The kind spoken of in murmured stories and passed over in guidebooks. Even locals nearby only nodded quietly when it came up, as if unsure whether it was real or a shared invention. But he had come here anyway. He needed distance. Stillness. Quiet. The rain soothed his thoughts. Each step deeper into the forest erased the weight of everything left behind. The trees stretched impossibly high now, their trunks damp with lichen, bark gnarled into patterns that seemed to twist and shift in the corner of the eye. He walked until he could no longer hear the hum of any road, until all he could sense was the soft percussion of rainfall and the dim smell of damp earth. At a small rise between the roots of two enormous trees, he stopped. There was a clearing here, barely 10 feet across. The stone beneath his feet was smooth and ringed with tiny red mushrooms. A perfect spot. Dry enough, with the protection of low-hanging branches, and just enough space to stretch out his gear. He crouched beside the small pile of firewood he'd brought and began assembling a modest fire. The tinder resisted at first, the humidity clinging to everything, but after a few careful strikes, orange sparked into life. He fed the flame slowly, hands steady, eyes soft. Rain tapped the canopy in delicate rhythms above, but the fire crackled confidently, defying the damp. Soon, warmth radiated out into the clearing. Shadows danced across the bark around him. The traveler settled onto a patch of moss beside the fire, unrolled his blanket, and leaned against his pack. The forest felt vast around him, too vast for any single man to be noticed. But still, it watched. Not unkindly. Just aware. The rain fell in long, whispering threads through the trees. Somewhere far off, a low rustle echoed like wind through a corridor, but there was no wind. The fire popped gently, sending a tiny ember floating into the dark. He let his eyes fall half shut, breathing in time with the slow rhythm of the world around him. Water trickled down from the high branches and disappeared into the roots. The trees creaked with age. And for the first time in what felt like a lifetime, he didn't feel the need to move. Sleep hovered near. Just before it took him, he heard it, soft and fleeting. A sound like a voice, carried between the rain and the crackle of fire. Low. Distant. Not quite words. And then, silence again. Only the rain remained. Part 2, Beneath the Stillness. The fire was little more than a bed of warm coals by the time he stirred. Night had fully arrived, cloaking the forest in a deep, dense black. The canopy above allowed no moonlight through, only a pale suggestion of silver here and there, where the leaves thinned for just a moment. Rain continued, lighter now, barely more than a fine mist descending like breath from unseen lungs. The traveler sat up slowly, feeling the dampness that had crept into the edges of his blanket. The embers still glowed, pulsing faintly in the center like the eye of something resting. He stirred them gently with a stick, coaxing a bit of light back from their heart. A flicker. A small breath of flame. The silence around him was thick, not dead, but waiting. Listening. He leaned back against his pack and let his gaze drift past the firelight. The trees stood in patient silence, towering sentinels wrapped in vines and thick with shadow. The further he looked, the more they seemed to lean slightly inward, as if listening to the faintest murmur beneath the rain. Something was different. Not wrong, exactly, but altered. The air had a strange stillness, not quite natural. The kind of quiet that feels like it's trying not to be heard. He'd camped in woods before, real woods, in real storms. There were always sounds, branches groaning, small animals shifting in the brush, the occasional owl. But this forest, it breathed in a way he couldn't explain. He turned toward the edge of the clearing. The trees there were tighter together, their roots tangled and bulging through the earth like knotted veins. Behind them, the shadows seemed deeper, denser. And carved into one of the tree trunks, just above eye level, was something he hadn't noticed before. A mark. A thin, almost delicate shape etched into the bark. Not fresh, not ancient. Just there. He rose quietly, stepping closer, letting the firelight behind him stretch toward the mark. It was a symbol, maybe a glyph. 3 lines, one bent into a curve, the other straight, forming a shape that felt almost familiar. As if his memory wanted to offer an answer, but had forgotten how. He reached out to touch it. The bark was cool and slick with rain, but the carving was dry. Perfectly dry. He pulled his hand back. In the distance, far past where the firelight could reach, something moved. A soft shifting sound, like someone brushing against wet leaves, then stopping. He stood still, letting the rain whisper down over his hood, heart quiet but awake. The fire popped behind him. A tiny coal skipped into the moss. Then came the whisper again. Closer. Not words. Not language. But sound shaped by breath. He didn't move. Just listened. The whisper rose slightly, then faded, like a hand retreating into fog. And with it, the stillness of the forest seemed to pull tighter. More present. He took a step back toward the fire. Not out of fear, exactly, just instinct. The fire welcomed him again with soft heat and crackling breath, the glow brightening enough to push back a few more inches of the dark. The symbol on the tree still lingered behind him, untouched, watching. He sat down slowly, drawing the blanket up again. The warmth was thin, but the sound of the rain, the constant, hypnotic rhythm, began to settle over him once more. And as he watched the coals breathe, a single thought curled quietly in the back of his mind. This place remembers. Even if no one else does. Part 3, The Stone Markers. By morning, the rain had steadied into a fine, unbroken curtain, gentle enough that it didn't seem to fall so much as hang in the air. The fire had finally gone out in the early hours, leaving behind a mound of soft gray ash ringed with tiny blackened stones. The traveler stood slowly, the blanket still wrapped around his shoulders. The world outside the clearing looked hazier now, a watercolor of muted greens and browns, blurred at the edges by mist. He stepped carefully over the wet roots and walked just beyond the trees that had encircled his camp. The soft squelch of mud beneath his boots followed him with each pace. Beyond the first ring of trees, the forest floor dipped into a narrow path, barely visible but undeniably there, like the ghost of something once walked again and again. The traveler followed it. The path wound between massive trunks and fallen logs, and as he moved deeper, the forest began to feel older, not simply untouched, but abandoned. Then he saw them. Stones. Low, weathered, and standing in quiet patterns just ahead. They emerged from the undergrowth like crooked teeth, partially swallowed by moss and centuries of decay. Each was about knee-high, their edges smoothed by time, surfaces covered in lichen and runes too worn to read. There were 5 of them, arranged in a loose circle. No obvious marker or trail leading in. The traveler approached the nearest and knelt. The stone was damp to the touch, but like the symbol on the tree the night before, the etched grooves were strangely dry. His fingertips traced a shallow spiral, so faint it was more a suggestion than a design. He couldn't tell if it was natural or deliberate. Then he noticed the center of the circle. A depression in the earth, subtle but unmistakable. Something had once been there. He stepped into the middle of it. The moment he did, the forest quieted. The rain didn't stop, but it muted, as though it fell somewhere far away. No birds. No insects. Not even the rustling of leaves. Only the steady breath of his own body and the sound of water slipping from leaf to leaf in distant layers. He turned slowly, scanning the trees. Each one around the circle bore marks, some deep, others so shallow they vanished when looked at directly. Curved shapes. Knots of carved spirals. Scratchings that almost resembled eyes. He stood there for a long time, unsure of what he was standing inside. A memory? A grave? A ritual? And then something shifted. Not movement, not sound. Just a shift in the feel of the clearing. A subtle pressure in the air, like the pause before a breath or the space between 2 spoken words. He stepped backward, out of the center. The pressure eased. The rain returned. He exhaled without realizing he'd been holding his breath. As he walked back to camp, the traveler glanced once over his shoulder. The stones stood as they had before. Silent. Watching. Waiting for no one in particular. But for a moment, just a moment, he had felt the shape of something very old. Not evil. Not kind. Just present. Something that had not forgotten. Part 4, A Hollow Tree. The fire was burning again. He hadn't expected it to catch in the drizzle, but something about this clearing, about the air and the way the rain curved as it fell, made fire easier to coax. It licked up from the damp wood like it had been waiting. As the flames settled into their slow dance, the traveler crouched nearby, his coat hanging on a bent branch to dry. He held the old kettle over the fire, watching thin trails of steam rise into the air, curling upward until they vanished into the heavy mist above. And still, the memory of the stone circle pressed against the back of his mind. There was something measured about those stones, deliberate. Not placed by chance. Not the work of nature. The symbols, the carvings, they felt too precise to dismiss as erosion or age. And the center of the circle, he still wasn't sure what he had felt when he stood in it, but it was real. He poured the warm water into a tin cup and sat down. Rain ticked softly off the leaves above. Steam drifted from his cup, mingling with the faint smoke curling from the fire. As he sipped, his eyes wandered. The clearing around him was quiet, almost peaceful. But beyond it, through a narrow cluster of trees, he saw something strange. A shape, pale and crooked, half swallowed by the underbrush. He stood, careful not to tip the cup, and stepped toward it. It was a tree, but unlike the others, its trunk was split at the base, wide enough to step into. A hollow. Not just a rot or decay, but a smooth, deliberate space. It opened like a doorway, tall enough to crouch inside, framed with twisted bark that looked sculpted, not grown. He crouched at the opening. Inside, the tree was dry. Not merely protected from the rain, but untouched by it. The earth was clean, the walls inside the trunk smooth and dark. And there, etched along the inner curve, was a series of marks. Symbols. Not runes, exactly. More like impressions left by careful hands. Circular designs, jagged lines crossing through them, repeating motifs, eyes, spirals, roots, flames. Some glowed faintly in the dim light, as if the wood itself remembered something. He touched one, an arching spiral with 3 dots in its center. The moment his finger met the groove, a sound rippled through the forest. Low. Like a sigh. The wind didn't move. The rain didn't shift. But the trees groaned, softly, almost mournfully. He pulled his hand back. The sound stopped. He backed out of the hollow and stood in the rain again, blinking against the mist. The campfire still burned in the distance, crackling away like none of this had happened. The cup in his hand had grown cold. His coat still dripped quietly where he'd left it. And behind him, the hollow tree stood with its silent door open, breathing out warm, dry air that smelled faintly of earth, ash, and something like forgotten incense. Whatever this forest was, it wasn't just wilderness. It had structure. Memory. Design. Not for humans, perhaps, but not for animals either. Something else. Something in between. And now that he'd seen it, now that he'd touched it, it felt like the forest had started watching him back. Part 5, The Buried Journal. The rain deepened that night. It wasn't the kind of storm that swept through with thunder and flashing skies. It was heavier in a quieter way, a slow, relentless downpour that seemed to soak not just the forest, but time itself. The trees bowed slightly beneath the weight of it, and the mist that hovered near the ground thickened, curling around roots and branches like a veil. The fire hissed and sputtered in protest, but it held. Somehow, it always held. The traveler sat close to it, his boots off and steaming near the flame, his eyes watching the embers dance. He hadn't spoken a word since returning from the hollow tree. Not out of fear, but contemplation. The carvings inside, the symbols, the way the wood seemed to breathe, all of it lingered in his thoughts like something remembered from a dream just after waking. He leaned forward, poking gently at the coals, then froze. Something beneath the firewood shifted, not the fire itself, but the earth below. He moved the log aside and saw it, a patch of moss that had grown over a strange mound of compacted soil. It was darker than the surrounding dirt. Denser. It looked disturbed. His fingers dug into the earth cautiously. Beneath just a few inches of soil and moss, his knuckles struck something flat. He scraped more away, revealing a faded, water-stained leather cover. A book, no, a journal, bound in a strange twine, edges swollen from moisture but still intact. He pulled it free and brought it into the firelight. The leather cover bore no title, only a faint indentation in the shape of a crescent and 3 dots. The same symbol he had touched inside the hollow tree. He opened it slowly, careful not to tear the damp pages. The writing inside was a spidery scrawl, faint and uneven, like it had been written in haste. The ink had bled in places, but much of it remained legible. He read in silence. Day 7, the rain doesn't stop. I thought I was just passing through, but the paths loop strangely. I've returned to the same stream 3 times, though I swear I turned away from it. Day 9, I found them again today, the stones. They changed slightly. The center was warm this time. I stood there for a while. Something moved beneath the soil. Day 10, I dreamt of firewood singing. Day 11, the symbols mean something. They feel like verbs. Not letters. Actions. Warnings, maybe. Day 12, the roots hum when you're quiet enough. The fire won't die. I stopped feeding it hours ago. The journal ended abruptly after that. No final note. No name. Just a page half filled with more of the symbols he'd seen in the tree, spirals, triangles, eyes, and one long black stroke that split the page from corner to corner like a knife wound. He looked up from the pages and into the woods. The rain whispered on. The trees loomed. And the fire, though now low and flickering, refused to go out. He gently closed the journal and placed it on a flat stone near his bedding, weighing it down with a smaller rock. The wind rose slightly, not enough to move the branches, but just enough to carry the faintest smell of something strange. Not rot. Not smoke. Something older. He lay back slowly and stared into the branches above, where the darkness held steady and the rain shimmered through the canopy like threads of silver silk. And just as sleep began to pull at him, he thought he heard a voice again, closer this time, shaped by breath and water. Not words. Not quite. But listening to it felt like falling toward memory. Part 6, Where the Animals Don't Go. By midday, the rain had thinned into a soft mist again, more present in the air than falling from the sky. The traveler moved slowly through the trees, the journal tucked securely into the inside pocket of his coat. The fire had resisted dying once more, and even now it smoldered quietly back in the clearing, as if it too had a reason to stay lit. He wasn't wandering aimlessly. He followed something subtle, something just at the edge of sense. A pattern in the way the forest pressed inward. The slope of roots. The way the moss grew. And most of all, the quiet. Too quiet. He crouched beside a gnarled log and scanned the earth. No paw prints. No droppings. No trails or burrows. No birds overhead. No buzz of insects near the wet soil. The forest here was not just still. It was avoided. He stood again and pressed on, deeper between narrow, skeletal trees where bark hung like parchment, flaking with age. The forest floor darkened as he walked, soaked with moisture and dotted with patches of dark fungus, slick and motionless like puddles of ink. And then he saw it. A stretch of ground ahead, completely untouched by footprints. No birds had landed. No squirrels had passed. Not even fallen leaves settled there. It was pristine. Unnaturally so. He stopped at its edge. The boundary was clear, on one side, moss and leaves and twigs, on the other, a smooth, untouched layer of black soil, damp and perfect like a sheet of paper waiting to be written on. He didn't step forward. Instead, he looked around. The trees in this pocket of the forest were different. Thicker, but not taller. Their trunks twisted together like braids, bark stripped bare in some places, exposing deep lines underneath that resembled ribs. He walked the edge of the boundary, circling. That's when he saw them, small totems hanging from the trees. little bundles of sticks, bound with twine and tied with faded scraps of cloth. Some had feathers. Others had bits of bone. All were silent and still, unmoving even in the gentle misted breeze. They reminded him of warnings, or offerings. He stepped closer to one and reached out. A shiver passed through him before he touched it, like walking through the memory of a chill. The totem swayed softly, just once, though no wind touched it. And beneath it, buried shallow in the dirt at the base of the tree, he saw a half-buried shape. He knelt again and brushed away the topsoil. What he found was simple, a stone disc, no larger than his palm, carved with the same crescent and three-dot symbol as the journal. He left it where it lay. There was a rhythm to this forest, and the more he saw, the more it felt like these objects were part of a map, like they were placed not at random, but in tune with something deeper. Something beneath the soil. He backed away from the untouched ground, careful not to let his shadow fall too far into it. As he turned to leave, the faintest whisper drifted past him, not from behind, not from ahead, but from beneath. He stood still, spine straight, eyes wide. It was a sound like breath through hollow wood. Not a voice. Not a word. But it was there. He stepped away slowly, retracing his path until the sounds of distant water returned, the distant hiss of rainfall meeting a shallow stream. It was the first natural sound he'd heard in hours. Only then did he realize how tight his chest had become. He exhaled slowly and looked back once. The untouched patch of forest stood silent, ringed by symbols, bone, cloth, and silence. And even though no animal had come near it, he had the inescapable feeling that something lived there all the same. Something without footsteps. Part 7, Voices in the Journal. The fire had grown taller by the time he returned. No wind had fed it. No fuel had been added. And yet, it danced higher than before, flames licking into the mist like something eager to speak. Its color was subtly changed too, less orange now, more pale gold, with flashes of blue at the base. The traveler stood at the edge of the clearing and stared for a long moment before stepping back into the warmth. He sat cross-legged and pulled the journal from his coat. Its pages were damp at the edges but still held firm. He ran his fingers along the leather cover. Somehow, the symbol on the front, the crescent and dots, felt clearer now, more deliberate. Like it meant something he was almost ready to understand. He opened to the page where the previous writer had described the roots humming. Outside the firelight, the forest remained silent. He flipped forward. There had been blank pages before, the final third of the journal had seemed untouched. But now, there were words. Not new pages. The same ones. But filled. Faint writing, in the same hand, though shakier now. The ink looked fresh, but the page was dry. He blinked, leaned in, and read. Day 13, I dreamt I was inside the fire. Not burned. Just surrounded. I saw faces in the flames, speaking in breathless tongues. I understood them then. I no longer do. Day 14, I buried the stone disc where I found the totems. I think it mattered. The forest shifted afterward. Paths reconnected. Day 15, there's something under the clearing. I hear it sometimes when I rest. Not movement, but depth. Not like roots. Like halls. Chambers. Day 16, I touched the tree again. The one with the hollow. It knows me now. It showed me something when I slept, something with no shape, only pressure and sound. Day 17, the fire never dies. It feeds on memory. It shows things I've not lived. The traveler's fingers tightened slightly against the leather. He turned the page. Day 18, if you're reading this, it's because you've started to hear it too. It begins with the rain. That's the signal. It always rains first. Don't dig near the stones again. Don't sleep facing west. Don't speak back when it speaks from under the soil. Not even once. The writing stopped there. He stared at the page. The words didn't look aged, they looked written recently, within the last hour. As if ink still dried faintly between the lines. He ran his thumb across the surface. Dry. Completely dry. He set the journal down slowly and looked around the clearing. The trees seemed farther away than before, drawn back by some unseen shift. The mist clung tighter to the edges, and the shadows between the trunks pulsed faintly, like something breathing in the dark. He turned toward the west. The side of the clearing where the firelight dimmed most quickly. Where the rain hit the branches with an unfamiliar rhythm. And for just a second, he thought he heard a voice. Not distant this time. Not beneath. But at the edge of camp. Watching. Waiting. It didn't speak a word. But somehow, he knew it could. And that it would. Part 8, The Fire Watches. The rain eased into a near-silent drift, so light it was more sensation than sound. Mist wove like thread through the trees, catching the low flicker of firelight in strange, flickering halos. And the traveler, wrapped in his coat and blanket, sat with his back to a tree, eyes open, but unfocused, watching the fire as it watched him. It had changed again. The shape of it. It no longer danced in random tongues, no longer popped and hissed like damp wood should. The flame rose slow and even now, curling and folding in ways that felt purposeful. Shapes formed in it, not faces, not figures exactly, but gestures. Silhouettes of movement. The outline of a reaching hand. The suggestion of a doorway opening, just at the edge of perception. He blinked slowly, unwilling to look away. The warmth no longer felt like simple heat, it was closer to presence. Like the fire was aware. Like it was, remembering him. Behind him, the forest sat in patient silence. But there were no night sounds. No owls, no rustling leaves, no scurrying paws. Just the hush of mist sliding over bark and the slow drip of rain from branch to root. Even that, now, sounded distant. Hollowed out. He glanced at the journal again. Its pages were closed, but the feeling of the words remained. Still fresh. Still there. He didn't need to open it to feel what was written. Don't speak back when it speaks from under the soil. He thought again of the voice he had almost heard. Not imagined, heard. The way it didn't quite make sound. The way it wrapped around the firelight like fog. He reached out toward the flames. Close enough to feel the heat. Close enough that the edges of the shapes shimmered. There was no pain. The warmth was gentle. Comforting, even. But as his hand hovered there, he felt something else. A pulse. Like the fire was breathing. Not a metaphor. Not a trick of the heat. A real, steady inhalation, like a deep lung within the coals, drawing in the moment through unseen ribs. He jerked his hand back. Not from pain, just instinct. The fire flickered sharply. And that's when he noticed it. In the glowing basin of embers beneath the flame, letters had appeared. Just for a second. Then gone. as if the ash had shaped itself into a message and then erased itself in the blink of an eye. He couldn't make out the whole word, but the middle of it had been clear. Home. He stood slowly, looked into the forest, then back into the fire. He wasn't sure which one the message had come from, or which one it referred to. He sat again, slower this time, gaze on the coals. Rain ticked against the top of his coat, unnoticed. The journal sat closed beside him, the symbol on its cover glowing faintly in the firelight like the memory of something once seen in a dream. And far off, deep beneath the roots of the forest, a sound moved like water through stone. Something had stirred. Part 9, The Light Between the Trees. The fire burned low and steady now, just enough to bathe the clearing in a soft amber glow. The rain had nearly stopped, just a thin, whispering mist remained, hanging like cobwebs in the air. Time stretched in strange ways here. The traveler wasn't sure if it was still night or already drifting toward another gray dawn. The forest gave no clues. He had barely moved since seeing the word in the coals. Home. A simple word, but not one the fire should have known. Not one that should have formed at all. And yet, it had. Now he sat with his back against the tree, staring into the darkness beyond the camp. The west side, the side the journal had warned against. There, the firelight thinned more quickly, retreating like a tide. That edge of the clearing seemed deeper, hungrier somehow. And now, there was light in it. A small, floating shape. Soft, flickering. Like a candle seen through fog. At first he thought it must be a trick of the firelight. But the longer he watched, the more certain he became, it was not a reflection. It was not his fire. It was something else. Hovering. Flickering. Moving. The traveler stood slowly. No sound from the forest accompanied him. The clearing remained hushed. He took a step toward the edge. Then another. The floating light backed away, slowly, steadily, drifting deeper between the trees, as if it had waited just long enough to be seen, and now invited pursuit. He hesitated. But the pull was too strong. The clearing felt suddenly confining. The fire too bright. That single light, out there in the wet mist, shimmered like a memory he hadn't yet had. So he followed it. Step by step, boots soft on damp moss. The trees seemed to part just slightly in front of him, then close gently behind. He never pushed aside a branch, they bent away just enough for him to pass. And always, the light remained just ahead. It never wavered. Never rose too high or fell too low. It moved as if on a quiet wind that only it could feel. Sometimes it pulsed softly, like it was breathing. Other times, it dimmed and returned brighter, like it was blinking. And still he followed. The further he walked, the less the forest felt like itself. The moss here glowed faintly underfoot, just enough to guide his steps. The trees leaned in strange ways, their trunks curving toward the light like they, too, were drawn to it. Vines hung from above, motionless and pale, almost brittle despite the humidity. And then, without warning, the light stopped. It hovered in place above a small depression in the ground, a natural basin surrounded by tall stones and curling roots. At the center was a single, flat platform of black rock, barely 3 feet across. Smooth. Polished by time. The light hovered above it, and went out. Gone. Just like that. But the traveler could still feel it. The space it had occupied shimmered in his vision, as though something had pressed into the air and left a memory behind. He stepped into the basin and felt the change immediately. The silence here was complete. No rain. No wind. No forest sounds at all. Only his breath. His heartbeat. The faint, cold hum beneath the ground. He stepped closer to the black stone. There, carved deeply into its surface, was the word. Stay. He knelt beside it, ran his fingers along the grooves. They were old. Worn. But the word had been made to last. Not a plea. Not a warning. Just a statement. An offer. He looked up, half expecting the light to return. But it didn't. He stood slowly, uncertain of what to do next. The forest had no answer for him, only the stone, and the silence, and the faint memory of firelight dancing in the mist. He turned back toward the way he'd come. The trees had shifted. The path was gone. Only silence remained. Part 10, The Tree That Listens. He didn't panic. That was the first surprise. He stood in the quiet hollow, the word "stay" still fresh in his mind, and turned in a slow circle. No path. No footprints. No landmarks he recognized. The light that had led him was gone, and the trees now formed a seamless wall in all directions, dark trunks standing tall like the bars of a sleeping cage. But he didn't panic. Instead, he listened. The silence here wasn't empty, it had weight. Depth. Like standing inside the pause before a whisper. And the longer he stood still, the more he began to hear it, not sound exactly, but shape. The suggestion of something vast and old, listening. And then came the wind. Not loud. Not cold. A single exhale, low and deep, sliding through the trees from nowhere in particular. It passed over his skin like smoke, curling around him, urging him not to run. He turned slowly, and saw the tree. It stood at the far end of the basin, wider than the others, taller, darker. Its bark twisted in slow spirals upward, and at its base, a wide notch formed a shape almost like an open mouth, silent and solemn. Its roots reached out like fingers, thick and knotted, tangled in the earth like old scars. Moss blanketed its sides, but in narrow rings, as though something had wrapped around it once and never left. The traveler stepped closer. The bark shimmered faintly in the mist. Not with light, but with memory. Shapes curled within the patterns, echoes of symbols he'd seen before. Spirals. Dots. Curves. Arrows. One symbol in particular stood out, a downward-pointing triangle, with a single horizontal line across it. He had seen it in the journal. He knelt at the base of the tree, not to pray, not from belief, but because it felt right. Like lowering his posture here was part of an old ritual he didn't remember learning. He rested one hand on the trunk. The wood was warm. And the instant he touched it, sound returned, not from the forest, but from within him. A rush of images filled his head. A fire burning in reverse, coals becoming logs, smoke flowing downward into the earth. Stones rising from soil, drawing circles in the moss. Eyes, not human, not animal, staring up from beneath the forest floor. Rain falling upward. A figure made of bark and ash, kneeling at this very tree, whispering words the earth itself seemed to echo. And then it stopped. He fell backward into the moss, breath shallow. The air seemed thicker now, but not threatening. Just, charged. Waiting. Above him, the canopy shifted, parting slightly. Through the smallest gap, he saw the gray sky for the first time in what felt like days. Pale. Vast. Still. He stood. There was no clear direction. No trail. But now, the trees no longer felt closed. There was space between them, a suggestion of passage. Not a path, exactly, but an allowance. He looked once more at the tree. And as he turned to leave, the bark at its base shifted ever so slightly. A new symbol had formed. Not carved. Grown. And though it made no sound, he understood what it meant. Return. Part 11, The Path That Wasn't There. He moved through the forest with a kind of quiet reverence now. The air had shifted again, subtly. Each step he took seemed to echo a little longer, not through sound, but through sensation, like the forest was memorizing his presence, committing the shape of his motion to some unseen ledger beneath the moss. There was no trail. No markers. No sign that anyone had walked this way before. And yet, he was undeniably being guided. Trees no longer pressed in like they had before. Instead, they leaned away from him slightly, opening in slow, spiraled patterns. Branches rose just above his head as he passed, and the mist seemed to follow him like a tide. He moved between wide trunks and under low arches of vine-draped limbs. The ground felt softer now, but not in a dangerous way. It gave slightly under his boots, like walking on a dream just solid enough to carry weight. In his coat, the journal felt heavier. He hadn't opened it again since the last entry had changed itself. But he felt it thrum faintly against his ribs now, like it wanted to speak again. Or perhaps warn. Still, he didn't stop. The air grew cooler as he descended a slow incline. Trees grew stranger here, some twisted into spirals, others hollowed at the base as if scooped by enormous hands. Their bark carried new patterns, diagonal scars, broad crescents, interlocked loops. And then, in the mist ahead, a shape emerged. Not a person. Not an animal. Something older. It was a structure. Low to the ground. Made entirely of wood and moss. Its shape resembled a large stone altar, but it had no edges, only rounded curves, like something formed naturally and then used with purpose. On its surface lay a single flat slate of bark, dark as coal and carved with rows of delicate symbols, arranged like a paragraph. He stepped toward it. As he reached the object, a breeze passed over the clearing, not cold, but sudden. A hush followed. Not just quiet, but a holding of breath. Even the ever-present mist seemed to pause in place, as if listening. The traveler knelt before the slate. The carvings were shallow, deliberate, and symmetrical. Not quite a language, but something adjacent. Like instructions written in a script older than writing. A code for the forest, meant only to be understood by those willing to sit with it, rather than read it. He reached out and pressed his fingers gently against the wood. There was no sound. But again, sensation rushed in. The feeling of being seen by something deep in the earth. The memory of another fire, long ago, burning in a different clearing, with voices circling it, unseen. A name not spoken in centuries, curling through the air like smoke. A warning. And a choice. He drew his hand back. The mist resumed moving. The forest resumed breathing. And the path that wasn't there, shifted again. Behind him, where there had been only trees, a new opening yawned wide. Not carved. Not grown. Just revealed. A tunnel formed by arching roots, barely high enough to walk through. The traveler stood slowly. He didn't need to ask where it led. He already knew. Back. To where it had started. To what waited beneath the soil. To what had always been there. Part 12, The Mouth in the Earth. He stood at the threshold of the tunnel. The roots curled above like the ribs of a great beast, woven together in such intricate spirals it seemed impossible they had grown this way by chance. Moss hung from the upper curves like curtains, slick with moisture, and the opening breathed a steady draft of cool air that smelled of deep soil and rain-soaked stone. He ducked inside. The path was narrow, forcing him to crouch slightly as he walked. The sounds of the forest faded behind him almost instantly. No birds. No wind. Not even the gentle murmur of rain. Only the subtle noise of his boots pressing into soft earth, and a low, humming silence that wasn't quite silence at all. It felt like something was speaking beneath the frequencies he could hear. Not in words, not in tones, but in presence. Like a low, subterranean voice vibrating through bone rather than air. The tunnel continued, curving gradually downward. The air grew heavier with every step. More humid. It clung to his skin and jacket like breath. The roots that formed the tunnel thickened, some bending low enough to brush his shoulders or forehead. Many of them pulsed faintly with a dull amber light, soft, like coals buried deep in ash. He passed markings carved directly into the roots. Symbols again. But different now. These weren't messages. They were faces. Not human. Not animal. Carved silhouettes of things with wide, hollow eyes and mouths that opened into spirals. Some were serene. Others wept. One looked like it was screaming, but silently, endlessly. He paused before this one, resting his hand gently against the side of its face. The root was warm. It trembled ever so slightly beneath his touch. He continued. The tunnel began to widen. The curve flattened, and the air cooled. The low light from the roots began to fade, replaced by a strange, blue phosphorescence seeping up from below, thin lines of glowing fungus crisscrossing the walls and floor like veins. And then he arrived. The tunnel opened into a chamber, not vast, but old. It was circular, its walls made entirely of black stone, as though the earth itself had grown around a hollow. Roots wove in and out of the ceiling like fingers through cloth, dripping with condensation that echoed softly as it struck the stone floor. At the center of the room, a pool. Shallow, motionless, and clear. It reflected nothing. Not his face. Not the roots above. Only the vague shimmer of blue light, as if the surface of the water existed beneath this world, rather than within it. He knelt beside it. The hum returned. Louder now. Not noise, but vibration. And then he heard it. A voice. No louder than breath. Not outside him. Inside. Do you see it now? He didn't answer. Not aloud. The pool shimmered. Shapes formed just beneath its surface, a fire that would not die. A forest with memory. A symbol with 3 dots and a crescent. A figure curled beneath the roots of a tree. Himself. You have touched too much, the voice said. Now the forest knows you. Another pause. Then softer. And it remembers. He reached toward the water. Before his fingers broke the surface, a single word echoed in his mind. Choose. But what the choice was, or what its cost might be, remained hidden, just beyond the veil. Part 13, The Echo of Others. His fingers hovered just above the water. The stillness of it was absolute. It wasn't just calm, it was deliberate, like something beneath it was choosing not to move. The faint blue light that traced along the roots and walls seemed to gather at the surface, bending toward his hand like threads of static. "Choose," the voice had said. But choose what? He pulled his hand back slowly. A ripple bloomed across the surface anyway, though he hadn't touched it. The water shimmered, once, and in that flicker, something changed. The chamber around him darkened. The roots seemed to pull back into the walls slightly, and the glowing fungus dimmed until only the faintest threads of light remained. The pool before him deepened in color, becoming a mirror of ink. And in it, reflections. Not his. Others. One after another, faint silhouettes appeared in the water, faces blurred by time, but close enough to recognize as human. Some leaned close to the surface, as if watching him. Others turned their heads to look into unseen corners of the chamber. One sat cross-legged, unmoving, eyes closed. All of them were silent. But all of them were here. Then a voice, fainter than before, but layered now. More than one speaker. They spoke not over each other, but as one. A chorus whispered from inside his skull. "We were here before you. We walked the roots. We opened the mouth. We asked for fire and were given memory. We asked for shelter and were given silence. We asked for truth." The chamber rumbled faintly. A drip of water struck the center of the pool. And we were given ourselves. The reflections faded. The water stilled again, and the light returned to the roots above, gentle and slow, as if waking from a long breath. The chamber pulsed once with warmth. And then, just beyond the pool, something shifted. A patch of wall that had seemed solid now softened, parting slightly like tree bark bending open. Behind it, a narrow passage, perfectly round, its interior lined with moss that shimmered with threads of green and silver. It had not been there before. But now it waited, open and silent. The traveler stood. The journal in his coat felt suddenly light, as if pages had vanished. He pulled it free. The last half of the book was blank again. But the inside of the back cover now bore a single phrase, written in the same tight, spidery hand. "There is no path forward that does not go down." He looked at the passage. Then at the pool. One would descend. The other had already shown him what came after. He turned to the passage. And stepped inside. Part 14, The Descent of Names. The tunnel narrowed around him, swallowing the faint blue glow behind. There were no roots here. No trees. Only slick stone and damp moss, the walls curved and breathing cold. The sound of his footsteps felt swallowed before it even touched the air. Water trickled somewhere deep below, not in streams, but in veins, thready, rhythmic pulses that beat like a buried heart. He walked without looking back. And with every step downward, the air grew thicker, laced with something earthy and old, like the scent of an untouched crypt, mingled with smoke and the faint memory of sap. After a long stretch, the passage opened without warning. Not into a cavern, not into a chamber, but a void. A perfect circle of space in the earth, wide as a cathedral, yet with no clear source of structure. The ceiling stretched up into blackness. The floor. Gone. Only a stone walkway remained, a narrow bridge suspended in the center, leading forward into a gray shimmer of mist that pulsed slowly like breath. He paused at the edge. There was no railing. No indication of what lay below. Only depth, endless, featureless depth. but not empty. He felt the presence of something waiting in it. Watching. Measuring the weight of his choice. He stepped onto the bridge. The stone was firm beneath his feet. Ancient, but whole. With each step, a low sound reverberated upward, not from the walkway, but from below. A murmur. A whisper. A language that wasn't language. It vibrated through his boots, into his bones. And then, voices. Real ones. All around him. Soft. Human. They spoke one word, again and again. Different voices, different tones, but the same word. His name. Whispered. Repeated. Echoed through the void like a chant. He froze. He had not spoken his name since entering the forest. Not aloud. Not even in his own mind. But here, the air knew it. The air used it. One voice, close and clear, whispered it again. And then added, "You are not the first to wear that name." He turned. No one stood behind him. Only mist. And darkness. He continued. As he neared the center of the bridge, faint lights rose from the blackness beneath. They hovered low, dozens of them, small, glowing white orbs, flickering like breath held between dreams. Inside each one, a shape. A figure. Some were standing. Some kneeling. Some curled on the floor. Each orb held a different posture, a different moment. Like memories captured mid-thought. And then he saw it. One of the orbs drifted closer to the bridge, just enough for him to peer inside. It was him. Not now, but younger. Sitting beside a campfire, staring into it with tired eyes. It was the fire from before. The first night. The mist. The carved tree. Everything. This was not memory. This was record. Another orb passed. Another version. Older. Wounded. Kneeling in the roots of a vast tree, arms wrapped around himself as if in mourning. And another. Standing in water waist deep, whispering something into the dark. Each orb shimmered and vanished as he passed. This path did not lead to the future. It descended into memory, but not just his. A network of selves, of names, of choices made in the same forest, under the same rain. He stepped carefully until the bridge finally ended, narrowing into a single stone platform surrounded by mist. There, at the center, a pedestal. Upon it, a mask. Woven from thin, pale bark, carved with the three-dot crescent symbol. The inside shimmered faintly with amber light. And behind it, nothing. Only dark. Waiting. He reached out. His fingers brushed the edge of the mask. And everything stopped. Part 15, The Mask and the Memory. The moment his skin touched the mask, time collapsed into silence. No sound. No breath. No heartbeat. He wasn't in the chamber anymore, not in the way that mattered. The pedestal, the mist, the walkway, all had fallen away like ash in wind. Yet he wasn't falling. He was still. Suspended. Held not by gravity, but by memory itself. And the mask was no longer just a thing he touched. It was looking back. His hand remained outstretched, but the mask now hovered on its own, rotating slowly, pulsing with light from within. Its texture, so delicate a moment ago, now appeared impossibly ancient. The bark shimmered with shifting patterns, images forming and dissolving across its surface, trees burning and then regrowing, faces laughing and then fading, the earth cracking open and spilling golden light. Then came the sound. A breath, not in his ears, but inside his lungs, as though something else had drawn air through him. And a voice. The same voice. No longer whispering. It spoke in calm, low tones. The forest wears many faces. You are the newest. But not the first. The mask floated closer. He could see now that it was incomplete, not broken, but waiting. There were grooves inside it meant to fit his features. Carved not by blade, but by expectation. You have walked the paths, the voice continued. Touched the roots. You have heard the silence that listens. The images on the mask grew faster. His own hands lighting a fire. A hollow tree. The journal in his lap. A circle of stones. A downward spiral. A hand reaching toward still water. Then the voice asked, "Will you wear it? Will you remember what came before you? Will you become the thing that watches, so that others may walk safely?" He didn't speak. But the forest already knew his answer. The mask moved forward and pressed gently to his face. And everything changed. It wasn't pain. It wasn't even sensation. It was awareness. He felt his bones remember things they had never touched. His skin recognized the chill of 1,000 rains. His breath echoed the firelight of 100 nights. And his mind stretched wide enough to contain roots. He was no longer a visitor. He was part of it. The pedestal cracked. The platform split. The chamber above began to fall inward like an eye closing for sleep. But he remained standing, alone, beneath the earth, with the mask now fused to memory, not to flesh. And the forest whispered around him. We do not forget our watchers. You are the voice between the trees now. The stillness in the rain. The choice others will find. Part 16, The Watcher Wakes. He did not remember waking. There was no moment of transition, no returning breath, no flutter of eyelids. One instant he was within the mask, suspended in memory, and the next, he was sitting once again beside the fire. It burned quietly. Low and steady, like it always had. The same logs. The same mist curling through the branches above. The same black stones that ringed the flame, still damp with rain. Only the journal was different. It sat open on the moss beside him, pages filled from edge to edge in dark, careful ink. His own handwriting, but of entries he had never written. The words flowed like thoughts half remembered. Not past, not present. Just, true. He turned a page. Then another. They described things he had not yet seen. Paths that forked in darkness. Pools of water that shimmered with forgotten languages. A tree that could speak when the wind passed through it at just the right angle. Warnings etched in bones buried beneath the moss. Names not spoken in centuries, but known to the forest all the same. His name was gone. Nowhere in the journal. Not on the first page. Not in the middle. Not even on the inside of the back cover, where he once might have written it for memory's sake. He closed the book softly. He wasn't afraid. Not anymore. Because something deep within him understood, this was not losing himself. It was becoming something older than identity. A thread in the pattern. A voice among the whispering trees. He stood slowly. The rain had begun again. A light, steady fall that barely touched the forest floor, caught in the high canopy above. The mist shifted, but did not part. The fire hissed gently, flickering gold against the gray of the afternoon. He walked to the edge of the clearing. The west side. No longer closed to him. The trees there moved gently, not from wind, but in recognition. Their trunks twisted just enough to form a passage, their roots curling back into the soil to reveal a narrow trail slick with moss and fog. He stepped into it. Each footfall was deliberate, measured. The forest didn't need to lead him now, it simply moved with him. Not like a guide, but like a companion. A quiet understanding passed between bark and breath, between footstep and fern. And behind him, the fire remained. Not unattended. Just waiting. It would burn until someone else arrived. Until another traveler stumbled into the clearing, soaked in rain, seeking warmth, seeking silence, seeking something they couldn't yet name. And when they did, the journal would still be there. The stones would be warm. The whisper beneath the soil would begin again. And he, now the watcher, would be listening. Part 17, A Stranger at the Edge. Somewhere far off, miles, or minutes, or memories away, the mist shifted. A shape moved through the rain. Careful steps, cautious posture. The crunch of twigs too wet to break fully, the occasional muttered curse beneath breath. A traveler. Not the same one. Not yet the same path. She wore a torn hood, soaked clean through. Mud clung to her boots like the forest didn't want to let go. Her pack was too heavy for her frame, swaying with every step like it might pull her backward into the trees. She didn't know why she kept walking. Only that stopping didn't feel safe. Not here. Not with the way the branches leaned toward her when she hesitated. Not with the way birdsong never returned after she'd passed a certain ridge. Not with how the forest listened when she spoke her own name aloud, like it needed to memorize it. She crested a low rise, boots sinking into moss, and stopped. There, below her, was a clearing. Circular. Mist-ringed. Quiet. At its center, a fire. Small. Still burning. She narrowed her eyes. No smoke trailed up. No scent of wood on the wind. Just flame, steady, golden, like it had always been there. Waiting. She slid down the bank toward it, one hand resting on a nearby trunk as she made her descent. Her breath slowed. There was no one at the fire. No tent. No pack. No voice. But there was a journal. It sat beside the flames, closed neatly, its cover beaded with fresh rain. No mold. No rot. Just waiting. She crouched beside it, hesitated, then picked it up. The leather was warm. The pages were dry. She opened to the first. Inside, a single sentence, in careful ink. You came looking for silence. Now listen carefully. She stared. Turned the page. More writing. Descriptions of trees. A hollow shaped like a mouth. A fire that refused to die. Paths that appeared only when rain struck stone. Names that were remembered even when forgotten. Symbols she swore she'd seen before, but only in dreams. She blinked slowly. The forest rustled softly around her. She sat. Not because she trusted it. Not yet. But because something inside her recognized the stillness here. The weight of it. The shape of it. The kind of silence that listens back. And somewhere deep within the trees, far beneath the soil, the watcher stirred. Not to interfere. Only to remember. Part 18, Beneath Familiar Branches. The fire crackled gently beside her, though she hadn't fed it. It didn't grow. Didn't fade. Just held, a steady flame that seemed untouched by wind or time. She turned another page in the journal. Some entries were short. Fragments. Incomplete thoughts like, the stone with the triangle was warm again. The tunnel breathes when I close my eyes. She left something under the roots. I didn't dig for it. Others were longer, filled with sketches of strange trees and notations of symbols she couldn't decipher. The symbols repeated, though, one in particular, the crescent with 3 dots. Sometimes it was carved in a circle of fire. Sometimes marked on stone. Once, she found it drawn in ash beside the word. Choose. She sat back, eyes scanning the tree line. This clearing was unlike anything else she'd passed. The forest didn't lean away from it, it respected it. Moss grew thicker here. The rain was lighter. Even the birds kept their distance, as if they, too, knew this space was set apart. Her fingers traced the edge of the journal. It didn't feel like something left behind. It felt like something placed. A test, maybe. Or a map. She turned another page. And stopped. There, in the center, drawn with the care of someone trying not to forget, was a sketch of the exact clearing she now sat in. Stones, fire, even the nearby stump split by lightning. And just below it, in the same careful hand. This is where I first heard it. She looked up. The mist had grown thicker again, but gently, wrapping around the trees like silk. And somewhere within it, the forest shifted. Not with footsteps, not with voice. With presence. Something was awake now. Something that hadn't stirred before. She rose slowly. The fire remained behind her. She knew, somehow, it would not follow. It was never meant to. Its job was to wait, not to move. The journal slid easily into her coat pocket. And then she walked, north, though no compass guided her. Between moss-covered trees and beneath branches that bent slightly toward her. The forest no longer felt aimless. It felt curated. Like a path remembered only by the land itself was being uncovered with every step she took. She passed a tree marked with a downward triangle. She passed another whose bark had been stripped clean in a spiral. She did not feel lost. But she did feel seen. And just ahead, through the mist, a shape waited. A figure. Not moving. Not speaking. Just watching. Part 19, The One Who Waits. She stopped walking. The shape ahead didn't move. It stood just beyond a curtain of mist, still and tall, as though carved from shadow. Not human, at least not clearly. Its outline wavered slightly, like heat rising from stone, and where its face should have been, there was only a pale gleam, soft, mask-like. No eyes. No mouth. Just that gentle crescent curve, flanked by 3 faint dots. The same symbol from the journal. The same she'd seen in her dreams. The fire behind her flickered suddenly. She turned, just once. Still burning. Still silent. She looked back. The figure remained. And though it never spoke, she heard it. Not in sound, but in memory. In the deep, unspoken part of herself that recognized places she'd never seen and words she'd never said. The forest had always spoken like this. You carry the book. The voice was not male or female. Not a whisper or a boom. It was weather. The hush before thunder. The wind inside trees. She didn't answer aloud. She didn't need to. The journal pulsed faintly in her coat. You've walked the waking routes. You've entered the silent clearing. The fire marked you. She stepped closer. The figure remained still, mist swirling slowly around its legs. The ground here was softer, more moss than earth. The air thick with stillness. The sound of her own breath pressed loud against her ears. You've come to listen, the voice said. But listening means forgetting. Are you willing to be unknown again? She stopped a few paces away. I don't know what I'm looking for, she said aloud, voice steady despite the fear curling just beneath her ribs. The figure tilted its head, just slightly. Then you're closer than most. It lifted an arm. Not a command. Not a threat. An invitation. A curl of its finger pointed to the space between trees behind it. The forest there was darker, deeper. The mist pulsed once like a sigh. That way, the path continued. But once she crossed it, she would not be able to turn back and see the fire again. She understood that. Knew it without question. The figure stepped aside. And for the first time, she saw the faint glow of symbols in the moss at its feet. Spirals. Triangles. The crescent again. One symbol pulsed brighter than the others, a circle within a circle, split by a vertical line. She stepped past it. And the figure didn't follow. She felt its presence remain behind her, a quiet guardian of that threshold. She was alone again. But the forest was not empty. It never had been. Part 20, Roots in the Shape of Memory. The forest closed around her like a breath held too long. The moment she stepped beyond the figure, the trees grew thicker, closer together. Branches arched overhead like the ribs of something ancient and sleeping. The light dimmed, though no sun had been visible since she entered the woods. This place had no day or night, only the rhythm of stillness and movement, of silence and voice. She walked carefully, boots sinking into moss that now seemed deeper than before. It cushioned her steps but offered no path. Still, she didn't hesitate. The air had shifted again, not colder, not warmer, just heavier. Like walking through the gravity of a memory. She ran her hand along the bark of a nearby tree. It was smooth in some places, jagged in others, the surface interrupted by spirals and ridges, like the tree itself had grown around something. Something buried. Something remembered. Then she noticed the roots. They were not random. They formed patterns, looping shapes and intersecting arcs, wide enough to walk between, narrow enough to be intentional. She realized she was no longer simply walking through a forest. She was walking within something. A map. Not drawn on paper, but grown in bark, inscribed in soil. A long breath of wind passed through the trees, not from ahead, but from beneath. And as she knelt to trace the lines in the moss, the ground seemed to respond. Shapes lit faintly just below the surface. Thin, thread-like veins of light. As if something beneath the forest was watching through the eyes of its own roots. She pressed her hand against the soil. And the voice returned, quieter now, more familiar. Names sink. Truth roots. Those who remember are shaped like those who forget. She closed her eyes. The forest pulsed once around her. And when she opened them, the moss ahead had parted. Not physically, but perceptually. She could see a new path now, one she would never have found by accident. Trees leaned just so. Ferns curved away. A single broken branch pointed like an arrow. She stood. Followed it. The ground sloped gently downward, and the smell of wet stone grew stronger. The air turned cool and still. Time seemed to hold its breath again. And then, ahead. A tree. Enormous. Wide as a house. Its trunk twisted into 3 spirals, fused at the center. Around its base, a ring of stones, worn smooth by rain and age. She stepped carefully into the circle. At the tree's base, a hollow. Not wide. Not deep. But just large enough for a hand. A shape carved into the edge above it, a familiar crescent, the 3 dots now etched inside the arc instead of above it. She knelt. The journal pulsed once in her pocket, then stilled. She reached toward the hollow. Her fingers brushed the inside. The bark was warm. Alive. And beneath it, something shifted. Part 21, What Sleeps Below. The bark gave way, not cracking, not breaking, but yielding, as though it had been waiting all along for her hand. Her fingertips touched something inside the hollow. Smooth. Cool. It didn't feel like wood. It felt like stone, or perhaps something much older pretending to be stone. She wrapped her fingers around it and pulled gently. It slid free without resistance. A small object emerged into the misted light, a disc, no larger than her palm, made of some pale mineral that shimmered faintly with layered patterns etched deep into its surface. Spirals within spirals. The crescent again, but turned downward this time. And at its center, carved so finely it could almost be missed. An eye. She held it up. It seemed to hum softly against her skin, not with vibration but with weight. As though it contained more time than space. The forest shifted around her, leaves rustling with a current that didn't belong to any breeze. A memory surfaced, one she didn't know she had. A fire, long ago. Not hers. Another's. A circle of watchers, seated in silence, each holding a disc like this. Not speaking. Just listening. To the forest. To the earth beneath. To what slept below. She blinked, and the vision vanished. The disc in her hand pulsed once, dimly, and then grew still. Behind her, the moss whispered. She turned. A root had pushed gently through the ground while she knelt. Not forcefully. Just enough to be seen. It stretched toward the clearing's edge and disappeared into the trees beyond. An invitation. Or a reminder. She pocketed the disc, rose, and followed. The path it revealed wound deeper than before. The trees here grew twisted together in high arches, forming a natural cathedral. Rain fell in thin sheets, barely making it through the canopy. The silence grew again, thicker this time. More intentional. Like a door had been closed behind her. And then she saw the stones. Tall. Weathered. Arranged in a loose spiral across a clearing so wide she could not see its far edge. Some leaned. Others stood perfectly upright. All bore carvings, not just of symbols, but of faces. Weathered, unreadable, but undeniably watching. She stepped between them. The air here was different. Older. Like sound itself had never fully entered this space. Her breath made no echo. Her steps barely stirred the moss. In the center of the spiral, a depression in the ground. Circular. Perfect. Water pooled there, black and unmoving. Deeper than it looked. Still as glass. She approached the edge. The water didn't reflect her face. It reflected roots. Vast, pale roots twisting in the dark beneath the earth. Moving, slowly. Like they were alive. And as she stared, the voice returned, softer than ever. Almost tender. Below memory is silence. Below silence is truth. Do not come here to name it. Only to see. She knelt beside the water. The disk in her pocket warmed. And beneath the surface, something opened its eye. Part 22, The Eye Beneath. The eye did not blink. It opened slowly, as if it had been sealed for centuries, not by lids, but by time. Vast, amber gold, and endless in depth. Not a creature's eye, not quite. There was no pupil, no iris, no clear edge to its shape. It was a presence, a gaze without a face, looking through the pool as if through a window. And it saw her. She didn't move. Her knees pressed into the moss, hands resting gently on either side of the depression, just inches from the surface. The forest was perfectly still, as though every tree, every branch, had paused in its growth to watch this moment. She felt no fear. Only recognition. The eye looked through her, not at her, but into her. Through memory, through questions, through the slow spiral of her path until now. And in its silent gaze, something passed between them. A knowing. She felt her chest tighten, not in pain, but in pressure. Like something inside her was being turned, slowly, like a key in a lock. Then she heard it. Not the voice from before. Not a whisper. But a sound, low, resonant, echoing from far beneath the surface of the forest. A vibration so deep it bypassed hearing and passed straight into her bones. And with it came images. Not memories. Not dreams. Truths. A forest grown over a burial ground too ancient for graves. Watchers who had worn the bark of trees and eyes of stone. A fire built not for warmth, but for containment. The rain falling as a shield, not a curse. Symbols passed hand to hand not as language, but as protection. Roots that listened. The eye watched. And then it began to close. Not in dismissal, but in trust. As it faded back into the dark beneath the pool, she felt something pass into her, a weight, a name, but not one she could speak aloud. It pressed softly into her chest like a fingerprint into wet clay. A mark not of power, but of belonging. She stood. The water stilled. The pool reflected only mist again. The stone circle around her remained silent, the faces on the monoliths now turned ever so slightly toward the center. Watching her. Remembering. She took the disc from her pocket. Its symbols now glowed faintly, one at a time, slowly pulsing. A path. A map. Or perhaps a heartbeat. She turned away from the pool. And the spiral of stones opened behind her, just wide enough to pass through. Another path awaited. No longer hidden. Only waiting to be remembered. Part 23, The Path That Knew Her. The spiral closed behind her. Not with sound. Not with motion. With memory. She didn't glance back. There was no need to. The forest wasn't behind or ahead anymore, it was with her. Around her. beneath her feet and beneath her thoughts. Every step she took now felt more like being guided than walking, as if the ground anticipated her weight before she placed it. The disc glowed faintly in her hand. Not bright. Not demanding. Just pulsing, one beat every few seconds, in perfect rhythm with something older than her own heart. She didn't need to look at it anymore. The glow seeped into her palm and guided her through the forest like heat from a fading ember. The path ahead was winding. Narrow. Branches leaned in so close they brushed her shoulders. At times, the trees bent above her to form long, darkened corridors, sheltering her from the rain she hadn't felt in hours. Moss grew thick enough to soften even her breath. And then she began to recognize them. Not places. Marks. Familiar carvings on bark. Some half-faded. Others fresh. The crescent. The triangle. The spiral. But now, they meant something. Each symbol like a word she finally remembered how to read. One tree bore the vertical line that had once appeared in the journal. Another held a pair of notches, side by side, chipped clean into the bark, almost like eyes. She stepped past a stone she knew she'd seen before, though it wasn't possible. It was cracked down the middle with ash between its halves, as if it had split from within. And beside it, footprints. Not hers. Fresh. She knelt, brushing her fingers across the damp moss. 2 sets. One light. One heavy. And leading toward them, from deep within the woods, drag marks. Like someone had been carried. Or had crawled. She followed. The trees grew stranger. One split in 2 and then rejoined above her head, its bark braided together like sinew. Another wept sap that shimmered silver in the dim light. She passed beneath a tangle of roots hanging from midair, connected to nothing. The disc pulsed harder now. Like a warning. Or an arrival. She came to a rise, just a shallow incline, and paused at the top. Below her, a hollow. At its center, a figure. Not the masked one. Someone else. Curled on the forest floor, shivering, back turned, hair matted with rain and moss. Clothes torn. Fingers clawed into the soil. Breathing, barely. She descended slowly. No birds called. No wind stirred. Just breath. Hers. The forests. The strangers. She knelt beside the figure. The disc pulsed again. The figure stirred. And whispered something so soft it might have been a memory. A name. Her name. Not the one she was born with. The one the forest had given her. Part 24, The Name Between the Trees. The voice was barely audible, no louder than the hush of mist through needles, but it struck her like thunder. Her name. Not the name she'd carried into the forest. That one had long since dissolved beneath the weight of moss and firelight. This was the true name, the one the roots had whispered when she slept near the spiral stones, the one the eye beneath the water had carved gently into her breath. And now someone else was speaking it. She looked down at the figure curled in the hollow. Mud clung to their arms, their face half buried in wet leaves. Their body trembled not from cold, but from exhaustion, the kind that sits beneath the bones. Like the forest had taken everything from them and left only enough to call out, once. She leaned close. The stranger flinched slightly, then opened their eyes. For a moment, their gaze was wild, flickering with fear, confusion, and the fading remnants of whatever they had seen before reaching this place. But when their eyes met hers, something settled. Recognition. Not of her face, but of her presence. The same way she had recognized the journal's pages before she ever read them. The same way the fire hadn't needed tending. The same way the forest made you feel like you'd been here before, even when you hadn't. They whispered again. You made it through." She nodded. "I think so." They shuddered, trying to rise. She helped them gently, slipping one arm beneath their shoulder. Their weight was heavy, but not just with fatigue, there was something else about them. Something that clung like a fog behind their ribs. An unspoken burden. They looked around, eyes tracing the tree trunks, the mist, the distant sound of water moving through roots. Their breath caught. "It's still here." "What is?" The stranger stared beyond her. "The thing I left behind." A pause. "The thing I was never supposed to find again." She didn't ask what they meant. Some knowledge in this forest wasn't meant to be carried in language. It lived in bark, in fire, in silence. She helped them stand. They swayed slightly but remained upright. The disc in her pocket had grown warm again. Not pulsing, just present. Like it acknowledged this moment. Like it approved. She looked at the stranger, then at the woods ahead. The trees were no longer still. They moved again, not with wind, but with intent. Leaning, shifting, parting in slow, wide arcs. A new path forming, not one of moss or stone, but of invitation. This wasn't the end of her journey. It was the beginning of someone else's. But now, for the first time, she wouldn't be walking alone. Part 25, Fire Between Shadows. Together, they walked. The stranger leaned against her for balance, but not completely. There was still strength in them, still purpose buried beneath the weariness. The forest accepted their weight. The moss softened, the trees leaned slightly outward, and the branches gave way without a sound. The path didn't feel like it had before. It wasn't circular. It didn't spiral. It climbed now, upward through denser undergrowth, where the canopy cracked and the sky appeared for the first time in what felt like days. Not sunlight, just pale gray, streaked with low clouds and long lines of drifting mist. But even that felt like a revelation. They reached a rise. Beyond it, in a clearing ringed by broken stones and twisted roots, a fire burned. Not the one from before. This one was taller, brighter. Orange and blue licked through the heart of the flames, and sparks rose in slow spirals, caught in a current of wind that didn't touch the trees. The clearing around it was still, the earth dry and cracked. There was no journal here. No circle of moss. Just the flame, and something beside it. A figure. Not masked. Not cloaked. Just, still. Kneeling. Head bowed. Arms resting on their thighs, palms upturned to the rain. The stranger beside her inhaled sharply. "I know them," they said. She glanced over. Not their face. Not their name. "But I know them." They stepped forward. The figure by the fire raised their head slowly. Eyes met. And the forest listened. The fire pulsed once, like a breath. And for a moment, the world tilted, not physically, but deeply, like gravity had shifted inward instead of down. The three stood in silence. And then the kneeling figure spoke. Their voice was clear. Calm. But older than it sounded. "You've brought it back." The stranger lowered their head. I didn't mean to. But you did. And that's enough. The fire flickered. The kneeling figure rose, slow and deliberate. Then turned to her. And you listened. You walked the roots. You saw the eye. You wore no mask, but you remembered the name anyway. She didn't speak. The disc in her pocket warmed again, just slightly. The kneeling figure stepped closer, and from beneath their coat, they drew out something small, wrapped in layers of dried fern and bark string. They offered it to her. She took it. Unwrapped it slowly. Inside, a seed. Small. Pale. Slightly glowing. The figure nodded. When the forest asks something of you, it does not want you to carry it forever. It wants you to plant it. She looked down at the seed. It pulsed gently in her palm. A warmth that was not heat. A promise that was not words. Then, behind her, the stranger spoke again. I remember where it should go. Part 26, The Place Where Seeds Remember. They moved through the forest in silence. The stranger walked unaided now, each step steadier than the last. Something had shifted within them, like the forest had taken some part of their weight, freeing what remained to walk forward. They didn't ask where they were going. They knew. She followed close behind, fingers curled gently around the seed wrapped in fern. It radiated softly against her skin, not with heat, but with memory. The kind that hummed beneath the soil. The kind that turned silence into growth. The trees ahead leaned inward, creating a long tunnel of green and silver. Rain filtered through in narrow strands, catching light that didn't seem to have a source. The sound was hushed and steady, like water falling inside stone. The stranger spoke, low and certain. I came here before. Not in this body. But in this forest. Long ago. She didn't question it. They moved between two trees split at the base but woven together above. A gate. She felt it as they passed, something brushing lightly against her shoulder, not branch or bark. A memory, perhaps. A threshold. Beyond the gate, the ground leveled into a shallow basin. It was empty. No stones. No fire. No carvings. Just earth, bare, dark, untouched by moss or root. The rain didn't fall here. The mist curved around the hollow like it, too, knew not to disturb it. The stranger stopped at the center and turned. This is where I left the name. And this is where you'll give the forest something back. She stepped forward. The soil was soft beneath her boots. She knelt and unwrapped the seed. It glowed faintly in her hand, one steady pulse, as if waiting for permission. She pressed it gently into the soil. And the earth breathed. A deep, low exhale that trembled through the ground beneath her knees. The mist swirled and the trees above rustled, not in wind, but in witness. The seed sank into the earth without a sound. And from where it vanished, a glow began. Faint at first. Then spreading, threads of soft golden light branching outward beneath the soil, forming a slow, spiraling pattern that mirrored the carvings she'd seen in the stone circles. The shape of roots. Of time. Of return. The stranger knelt beside her, eyes closed. The glow did not fade. Instead, something rose. Not from the seed, but from the space around it. A stillness. A presence. And then, a voice. Not a watcher. Not a memory. But the forest itself. She has planted what was remembered. He has returned what was carried. Now we will grow what has never been spoken. The light faded into the soil. The earth stilled. And something new took root. Part 27, What the Forest Keeps. They remained there a long while, kneeling in the soft hush of the basin. No words passed between them. There was no need. The seed had taken hold, not just in the earth, but in the moment, anchoring it. The forest was no longer guiding them, it was holding them, like a breath held between the beat of raindrops. The light from the soil had faded, but something lingered in its place. A warmth that radiated without fire. A presence that did not demand to be seen. They stood together. Above them, the canopy shifted. Slowly. Intentionally. The leaves tilted upward, letting the first full shaft of gray sky pour through. The rain touched their faces, cool and thin. Cleansing, in its way. Almost reverent. The stranger exhaled and looked down at the place where the seed had vanished. It's deeper now than it was before. She nodded. The basin no longer looked like a simple patch of earth. The lines etched by the seed's glow were gone, but their shape remained in a pattern of roots and scattered leaves. A spiral in the way the moss grew. A circle in the way the trees leaned. Not a mark. A memory. She turned and began walking, and the stranger followed. They did not need to speak. The path was already unfolding. The trees shifted around them like the slow drawing of a curtain, revealing new stretches of forest untouched by their earlier journey. The ground dipped and rose, marked now by shallow ridges like the impressions of long-forgotten rivers. She reached for the disk in her pocket. It had cooled. Not dead. Just resting. They passed a tree she recognized. Not from sight. From feeling. Its bark was cracked in a spiral. A knot like an eye stared out from its base. Once, it had frightened her. Now, it simply watched. Not to judge. Only to remember. Then a clearing opened before them, different than the others. Wider. Walled on all sides by stone columns, each one leaning slightly inward as though listening to the center. At the heart of the clearing, a figure. Not cloaked. Not masked. But old. Older than either of them. Older than the forest, even. A woman, or something like one, seated cross-legged on a low, smooth stone. Her skin was weathered bark. Her eyes dark hollows moss clung to her shoulders, and her hair was a tangle of roots threaded with droplets of rain. She opened her eyes. They shimmered, not with light, but with depth. Like looking into a place far beneath the surface of knowing. She smiled faintly. So, she said. One carries a path. One returns from forgetting. Neither of them answered. She reached down and lifted something from her lap, a second seed. Identical to the first. But this one burned, softly, from within. She held it out. For what comes next, you'll both need to listen deeper. This one doesn't root in soil. This one roots in choice. Part 28, The Seed of Choice. The seed glowed like a coal long buried, its light steady, its warmth unsettling. Unlike the one planted in the hollow, this seed pulsed with something heavier. Not memory. Not guidance. Something more dangerous. Possibility. The forest around them didn't stir. It watched, through every knot in every tree, every drop of hanging rain, every shadow beneath the stones. This was not a place of growth. This was a place of decision. The stranger reached forward instinctively. But the woman on the stone shook her head slowly. "This seed does not respond to hands," she said, voice low and thick with mossy age. "It chooses who will carry it." The seed hovered just above her open palm, spinning slowly, the glow inside shifting between soft gold and deep red. She looked to the traveler. She looked to the stranger. Neither moved. Then the seed began to drift. It turned away from the moss-wrapped woman, floated forward, passed between them, and stopped. Between them. Exactly equal distance. Its glow steady. "It will not choose," the woman said. "It is waiting to be chosen." Rain fell again, silent and even. The seed hovered like a question. She looked at the stranger. He looked at her. Something unspoken passed between them. A weight neither could carry alone, yet both had already borne pieces of. The choice wasn't about possession. It was about intent. She reached out first, not with haste, but with certainty. Her fingers paused just shy of the seed's edge. "I won't use it to control," she said. "I'll listen. And I'll remember." The seed pulsed, once. Then the stranger stepped forward. He placed his hand below hers. "I won't forget again," he said. "Even if it hurts." The seed flickered, then split. Silently. Cleanly. Two halves hovered, one above each of their hands. Each dimmer now, but no less alive. The woman nodded. "It is done." She folded her arms, moss dripping from her sleeves. "One of you will place it. One of you will carry it. Both of you will be changed." She stood. Her joints creaked like old trees in wind. The forest is not only what grows. It is also what waits. With that, she turned and stepped backward into the mist, and was gone. Not vanished. Not fled. Simply returned to something deeper. The two of them stood in the stillness. Rain fell quietly on stone. They looked down at the twin seeds in their hands, dimmer now, but warm. Heavy with something they didn't yet understand. And behind them, the forest opened a new path. Narrow. Winding. Lit by the soft glow of something beginning. Part 29, The Path with Two Shadows. They did not speak as they walked. Words would have crumbled in the air between them, fragile and unnecessary. The forest had grown quieter still, if such a thing was possible. Not the silence of emptiness, but the kind that comes just before something is revealed. The kind that listens back. The path ahead was narrow, but clear. Stones had arranged themselves in uneven steps, slick with rain. The trees arched tightly above, forming a winding corridor where the mist pressed in like breath between ribs. Each carried their half of the seed. Hers pulsed faintly in her left hand, low and slow, like the heartbeat of something dreaming. His glowed more erratically, sometimes brighter than hers, sometimes not at all. And she noticed how he gripped it tighter when the forest pressed too close. How his steps hesitated when they passed trees that had faces in their bark. They came to a bend. A fork. Two narrow paths split the mist. One curved downward, toward darkness thick as old smoke. The scent of damp stone and deep roots drifted upward from it. Earth. Memory. Stillness. The other rose, climbing toward the edge of the mist canopy, where faint light flickered between high branches. A smell of lightning. Of burning leaves. Change. She turned to him. Without speaking, they knew. This was the place the forest had meant for them to choose. Not between danger and safety. Not between right and wrong. Between what to carry and what to plant. He spoke first. "Mine belongs below," he said. "It always did." She nodded slowly. "And mine will become something new." They exchanged one last look. Not goodbye. Something older. Recognition. He took the left-hand path, disappearing into the darker descent. His half of the seed pulsed once as he vanished around the bend, and the mist folded behind him like closing wings. She turned right. Her ascent was steep, but the forest helped her now. Vines coiled into handholds. Roots flattened into steps. She felt not watched, but lifted, as though something beneath the soil whispered encouragement. At the top, the path opened into a ledge. Wind moved here. She hadn't felt wind in hours, or days. The trees thinned, and ahead was a rise of smooth stone, flat and wide, surrounded by a circle of elderwood trunks that bore no leaves. Just pale bark, carved with thousands of lines, none of them straight. Spirals. Waves. Roots. She stepped into the circle. The light here was strange, not moonlight, not firelight. A glow that came from within the air, like the forest was remembering something in real time. She placed the half-seed at the center. And it did not sink. It rose. Just slightly. Hovering in place, pulsing steadily. Then the lines carved into the trunks began to glow, slowly, each one lighting like a vein catching starlight. She stepped back. The forest inhaled. And her half of the seed began to bloom. Not into a plant. Not into flame. But into sound. A deep, low chime that echoed into the trees and came back softer. Not an alarm. A signal. A reminder. That something had returned. And something else had begun. Part 30, where the forest speaks back. The chime lingered in the air, suspended like fog light through water. It didn't fade, it settled, folding itself into the rhythm of the forest. She felt it behind her eyes, inside her chest, deep in the soles of her feet. Not a sound to hear, but one to carry. The half-seed hovered still, spinning now in place above the stone where she had left it. Its faint glow matched the pulse of the lines etched in the surrounding trees, each one flickering softly like breath drawn in shadow. The forest had accepted it. She felt it. Not in words, but in response. The wind changed direction. Briefly. Softly. And the leaves above turned upward instead of down. Something had shifted. She took a step back from the stone. The glow did not fade. The sound remained, but behind it now, layered like echoes stacked in time, she heard something else. A voice. No. Voices. Layered. Interwoven. Dozens, maybe hundreds. Speaking not in a language she recognized, but one her bones understood. Memory stirred, not her own, but something older. Something the forest remembered through her. They spoke not as warnings, nor as command. They welcomed. The forest does not end. It folds. It deepens. What was lost has been carried. What was planted will awaken. The path will remember your steps. Just as you remembered its silence. She turned slowly, letting the full circle of trees surround her. Every trunk pulsed gently now, as though alive, as though aware. They were not just trees. They were the memory of trees. Watchers. Listeners. Holders of names that had been spoken and forgotten. And now, hers was among them. She looked down at her hands. They glowed faintly. Not with light, but with recognition. She had given something back. And in return, the forest had left a trace on her. Not a mark. Not a scar. Something quieter. A belonging. Behind her, the seed, her half, rose higher into the air. It split again. Once. Twice. 3 times. Each fragment drifted slowly outward, carried by a wind that didn't touch the branches. One floated east, one west, and one straight up into the canopy, vanishing into the mist beyond sight. She didn't chase them. They weren't meant to be followed. They were meant to find their way. As she had. She stepped from the circle. The glow behind her remained. But the path before her shifted again. It no longer wound aimlessly. Now it led forward, straight and certain, through trees that no longer pressed inward but bowed gently as she passed. And far ahead, at the edge of the mist, a figure waited. Not cloaked. Not masked. Familiar. The stranger. And behind his eyes, something new. Part 31, What the Forest Returned. He stood beneath a narrow arch of roots, where the path from below met the one from above. Rain slipped gently between the twisting branches, catching faint glimmers of light that hadn't been there moments before. The stranger looked different. Not in his face, though it, too, seemed changed, but in the way he stood. Straighter. Lighter. As though something once bound inside him had finally let go. His eyes, when they met hers, no longer darted like prey in deep woods. They held. She approached slowly. Neither of them spoke. They didn't have to. Between them, something passed, something invisible, but felt. The forest had taken them both, in its way. Carved out what did not belong. Planted what did. And now it brought them back together, not as the same people who had entered, but as reflections of what they had learned. He stepped forward. Held something out. It was his half of the seed. Except, it wasn't a seed anymore. It had changed. Twisted slightly, like it had grown roots inside itself. Veins of silver ran through its surface now, and etched into one side was the shape of a spiral, burned clean into its shell. He placed it in her hand without a word. She turned it over slowly. And in that moment, the forest spoke again, not in sound, but in a surge of memory. Not hers. His. She saw what he had carried into the dark. A cavern of roots, breathing like lungs. A chamber where silence screamed. And a stone altar wrapped in vines that bled sap like tears. There, he had planted his burden, not as an offering, but as a confession. She blinked. The memory faded. He exhaled. It needed both of us, he said quietly. It always did. A long pause. Rain continued to fall, but it no longer felt cold. It felt cleansing. She looked down at the seed now no longer seed. And realized, it was no longer meant to be buried. It was meant to lead. From behind them, the mist thickened. Not to obscure. To protect. The path they had walked was folding closed, sealed by what they had left behind. Ahead, the forest parted. A final path revealed itself, lined with upright stones, smooth as river glass, each one pulsing faintly with light that felt hopeful. He looked at her. She nodded. They stepped forward together. Not as strangers. Not as guides. Not as witnesses. But as part of the forest now. Named. Remembered. Needed. Part 32, The Stones That Remembered. The path was silent, but not in mourning. The kind of silence that followed understanding. A hush that invited reverence, not fear. They walked between the stones, side by side. Each marker glowed faintly as they passed, not bright, not showy, but with the quiet dignity of memory. Some bore symbols, spirals, crescents, triangles. Others were marked only with grooves worn deep by rain and time. A few shimmered with colors that shifted in the mist, amber, ash gray, green like old moss. None were the same. None repeated. Each was a name. She didn't need to ask. Somehow, she knew what they were walking through. "It's a grove," he said quietly beside her, as if reading her thought. "Where the remembered are kept. Not buried. Held." The forest felt broader here, wider in its breadth, taller in its silence. Trees spaced themselves naturally apart, their roots weaving together beneath the stone markers like threads of a story not yet finished. They came to one stone taller than the rest. Its surface was smooth, fresh, as if the rain hadn't yet had time to age it. But it wasn't blank. Carved deep into its face was the shape of the disc she'd carried, the vertical line through the circle. And just beneath it, something new. Her true name. Not in letters. Not in any language she could speak aloud. But in the curl of the spiral. In the spacing between the lines. In the way the grooves caught the light. A name the forest had given her, because she had walked, watched, planted, and remembered. She reached out and touched the stone. It was warm. Alive. Behind her, the stranger rested a hand on another marker, one shorter, chipped at the corner, half covered in creeping moss. As he touched it, the moss slowly withdrew, revealing a symbol she recognized, two crescent arcs facing each other. A mirror. He looked at her, and for a moment she saw it again in his eyes, that trace of the person he had been before he remembered. Not lost. Not broken. Just waiting to return. She stepped back. Together, they left the grove behind. The stones glowed gently in their wake, and the trees swayed as if nodding in approval. The mist began to shift again. Not hiding the path. Revealing it. Ahead, the forest narrowed once more, leading them through a tunnel of arching branches toward the sound of water, soft, rhythmic, familiar. A river. Not rushing. Flowing steady and deep. The place where memory leaves the forest, and becomes story. Part 33, Where Water Carries Names. The sound of the river was gentler than she expected. Not crashing or rushing, but soft, like breath sliding across a sleeping body. It curved through the forest with deliberate grace, carving its path as it had for centuries, maybe longer. The air grew cooler as they neared it, laced with the scent of wet stone and old leaves. The forest stepped back to make space. Here, the trees didn't crowd. They watched. Tall trunks leaned slightly outward as if giving room to something sacred. Their branches formed a high canopy that let pale gray light through, casting ripples of motion on the water below. Mist clung low to the river's surface, swirling with every shift of breeze. She and the stranger stood at its edge. Neither spoke. Across the river, a flat stone jutted out like a natural altar. Atop it, an old tree leaned sideways over the water, its roots exposed in a graceful arc woven between those roots, offerings. Strips of bark, tokens of carved bone, coils of silver fern. Names, likely. Memories. Echoes of those who had come before. Not forgotten. Just passed forward. The disc in her pocket stirred. She drew it out. It pulsed softly in her palm, not like before, no longer with urgency or command. Just a rhythm. Steady. Steady. As though the forest's breath now moved through her hand. The stranger looked to her. "It wants to cross," he said. She nodded. Without hesitation, she stepped into the river. The water was cold, but not harsh. It parted around her ankles, then her knees, then her waist. Every step felt like slipping through silk woven with memory. She didn't fight the current, it didn't pull her. It held her, like a guiding hand. Behind her, the stranger waited at the shore. He did not follow. He wasn't meant to. She reached the stone in the center of the river and climbed atop it slowly, her boots slick on the mossy surface. The tree above her creaked gently, shifting its limbs like waking. She knelt. Placed the disc on the stone. It didn't glow. It sank. Melted into the surface like ink into paper, disappearing without a sound. And then the river changed. For one long moment, it stopped. The current went still. The sound ceased. Mist coiled tightly around the surface. Then, from upstream, something emerged. A shape. Drifting. Slowly. A second disc. But this one was different. Smaller. Thinner. Its surface dark and smooth like river glass. No symbols carved on it. Just a single spiral of light spinning slowly beneath its surface. She reached down and lifted it from the water. It was warm. And on the wind that followed, a whisper returned. Not all names are kept. Some are carried. She looked back toward the shore. The stranger was still there, waiting, silent, watching. She stepped from the stone and let the river carry her gently back. Part 34, The Disc with No Name. The water bore her like a cradle. It did not rush, did not spin. It carried. She floated with the current, the smooth black disc clutched gently in one hand. It was smaller than the first. Thinner. Almost fragile in her fingers, yet as she held it, she could feel it humming, not with memory, but with intent. By the time her feet touched the riverbed again, the mist had shifted. The stranger waited where he had stood, still watching. She climbed the bank in silence, boots dark with water, and stood beside him, holding out the disc. He looked at it, eyes narrowed. "It doesn't belong to either of us," he said. She nodded. "It belongs to what comes next." Together, they turned to face the forest once more. The trees ahead had changed again, wider spacing now, more light between trunks. The oppressive closeness of before was gone. No pressure. No testing. No eyes. The forest now welcomed. And in that welcome, a new path revealed itself, not marked by stone or firelight or carvings, but by the faintest shimmer in the moss. A glow that didn't pulse or fade. It simply was. They walked together. The air felt lighter here. Not empty, but released. The scent of earth was soft, no longer damp with rot or age, but fresh, like the first turning of spring. The mist remained, but it had thinned, rising higher into the trees like breath let go. As they passed between the roots of an ancient tree, the stranger spoke. I remember now. What I left behind. What I came here trying not to see. She waited. He touched a small scar on his wrist. Not new. Not old, either. I wasn't meant to survive the last place I came from. But the forest, it took that memory and folded it in. Not to erase it, but to teach me how to carry it. He looked down at her hands. That disc. It's for someone else, isn't it? She looked down at it too. The spiral on its surface shimmered softly. It didn't seem to reflect the trees or the sky. It reflected movement, not what had happened, but what might. A choice. A next step. Not hers. She tucked it carefully into her satchel. They continued walking. And the trees began to thin. Ahead, through the trunks, she saw something pale. Not light. Not mist. Sky. Open sky. The edge of the forest. The place where everything they had carried would have to be decided. Part 35, The Forest's Last Gate. The sky widened before them. Not suddenly, but slowly, like a curtain pulling back inch by inch. No dramatic line between forest and field. The trees simply grew farther apart, the mist rising higher until it became cloud, and then even that began to thin. They had reached the forest's edge. But it wasn't an ending. It was a threshold. Where the last roots touched open soil, two great trees stood, tall and silver-barked, their trunks leaning toward each other like guardians in quiet conversation. No leaves stirred on their branches. Instead, their limbs reached across to one another, weaving a canopy arch overhead. A gate. It did not glow. It did not hum. But it watched. They stepped toward it. The stranger paused beside one of the trees and placed his palm on the bark. He closed his eyes. Just for a moment. Then he whispered. Thank you. The tree didn't move. But the air around it grew still. She stepped through first. Beneath the woven arch, the ground was smooth, no moss, no roots. Just earth. A narrow line of soil worn flat by steps that had come before hers. She held the black disc tighter in her hand as she passed beneath the boughs. And as she did, she heard the gate. Not a sound. Not exactly. A knowing. You may carry memory beyond our roots. But carry it gently. And never speak of it louder than a whisper. She nodded, even though no one could see her. And then she was through. Behind her, the stranger followed. And together, they emerged into a landscape unlike anything the forest had offered them. A high hill sloped downward before them, blanketed in soft grasses and low, wind-bent shrubs. Far in the distance, other forests. Other mountains. A line of rivers that shimmered under a pale and sunless sky. It was not bright here. But it was open. The forest no longer held them. But it watched from behind. Quiet. Enduring. Waiting for when they, or someone else, might one day return. The stranger turned to her. So, he said. Where do we go now? She looked down at the disc in her hand. Its spiral shimmered softly. Not guiding. Just offering. She smiled, just faintly. Wherever someone has forgotten their name. Wherever something needs planting. And with the forest behind them and silence ahead, they began walking once more. Not toward endings, but toward what must come after. Part 36, The Wind That Knows No Walls. They walked in silence across the open land. No longer bound by the forest's hush, the air here moved differently. It tugged at their clothes, tousled their hair, whistled low through the grasses as if it had its own stories to tell, tales of hills and wide sky and places where roots could not reach. She noticed how her breath felt different now. Lighter. Easier. But also, lonelier. Without the trees pressing close, the space around her felt exposed. Not in danger. Not unwelcome. Just vast, too vast, maybe. After so many nights curled beside firelight beneath a ceiling of moss and fog, the sky now seemed like a wound too wide to cover. Beside her, the stranger breathed deeply. "Feels like a second first breath," he said. "Like we were underwater, and only now came up." She didn't answer. Instead, she reached into her satchel and pulled out the black disc. The spiral shimmered gently in its core, slower now. As if resting. As if waiting. They crested the next hill, and below them stretched a long expanse of land, not barren, but untouched. Rolling meadows with scattered stone formations, and in the far distance, the flicker of a small settlement. No lights, no movement, just suggestion. It felt wrong to approach it too quickly. Instead, they sat beneath a crooked tree at the top of the hill, where the wind gathered like a messenger returning home. The sky above held clouds that didn't move. Not frozen. Just patient. She turned the disc over in her palm. It no longer felt like a tool. Or a token. It felt like a question. The stranger spoke again, softer now. "There'll be others, won't there? People like us. Who feel something pulling at them in the dark. Who carry something they don't understand." She nodded slowly. "And when they come to the edge of the forest, someone will need to help them walk through." The disc warmed. A quiet signal. Not instruction. Permission. She looked out across the open land. And it struck her. The forest had not ended. It had changed shape. Now, its roots moved beneath open fields. Its memory carried by those who had walked its paths. It whispered through them. They were no longer merely travelers. They were keepers now. Carriers. Planters. She leaned back against the crooked tree and closed her eyes. The wind moved around her, never quite touching, never quite still. And somewhere, far off, across the hills, she thought she heard a familiar sound. Rain. Falling in a place that still remembered her name. Part 37, When Rain Falls Far from Trees. Night came gently. There was no clear shift, no sudden dimming of light. The sky simply rested, turning softer, the distant horizon blurring into shades of violet and ash. Stars did not pierce the dark here. Instead, the clouds thickened slowly, curling over themselves like sleeping animals, until the sky was a soft, glowing ceiling. And then, without fanfare or flash, rain. Not heavy. Not loud. But present. It began as a whisper in the grasses. The sound of small droplets threading through wildflowers, tapping on stone, soaking into the open, rootless earth. It moved around them in slow spirals, turning the hill into something living once more. She lifted her head. The crooked tree above her groaned softly in the wind. Raindrops gathered along its twisted branches, then fell one by one in steady rhythm. Beneath its sparse leaves, she and the stranger sat, both quiet, both listening. "It followed us," he said, eyes half-lidded. "Or maybe it never stopped." She looked down at the black disk in her lap. The spiral within it glowed faintly, blurred now by the mist collecting across its surface. It pulsed not like it once had, not to lead, not to warn, but like something breathing, matching the pace of the rain. She spoke softly, not to break the quiet, but to join it. "Do you think the forest remembers the ones who never make it through?" He considered this. Maybe it doesn't forget anyone. Just waits until they're ready to return. She nodded. The rain thickened, though never growing harsh. It moved like a veil drawn across the land, hiding nothing, but softening everything. And as it fell, she felt something stirring beneath her, just below the earth. Not roots. Not stone. But a knowing. Like the ground had eyes. Not to judge. Only to watch. She reached into her satchel again. Not for the disc. But for the seed. The third one. Not the one planted in the hollow. Not the one given at the river. The one left behind in the spiral grove, found later, wrapped in bark and bound with twine. She didn't know how it had gotten there. Only that it had waited for her. She held it up now to the rain. The seed glistened, its surface pale and smooth, with a single crack down the middle. Not a break. A seam. It was ready. The stranger leaned forward. "You going to plant it here?" She shook her head. "Not yet. Not until I find the one who needs to plant it themselves." "And the rain." Agreed. It fell a little softer then. Like gratitude. Like trust. And beneath that crooked tree on the edge of forest and field, she closed her eyes again, the weight of the journey folding quietly beneath the hush of rain. The seed rested in her hands. The disc in her satchel. And her name. Her true name. Drifted through the mist without need for voice. Part 38, The Sleeper Beneath the Hill. The rain continued long into the night. Not a storm, just a steady presence. A kind of lullaby composed by the world itself. Every drop on leaf and stone seemed measured, deliberate. And beneath it, the hill softened. The grass drank quietly. The earth sighed. And something below it stirred. She woke with the feeling of having been watched, but not by eyes. Watched the way a river watches the shore, or a flame watches the dark. The kind of gaze that feels not intrusive, but aware. The stranger was still asleep beside the tree, one hand curled beneath his chin, the other resting near the faint glow of the disc in her satchel. Even in rest, it pulsed faintly, like a lantern left burning for someone on a distant path. She stood. The rain had lightened to mist, and the grasses around them steamed faintly, releasing the scent of damp roots and the deep underside of the world. The hill no longer felt like a hill. It felt like a lid. She walked forward, slow, deliberate. Her boots pressed into the soaked ground, and with every step, she felt it more clearly, a pattern in the soil. Not carved. Not placed. Grown. A spiral. So faint that she wouldn't have seen it if not for the mist pooling in its channels. She knelt. Touched the earth. It breathed back. And beneath that thin skin of dirt and rain, she heard something impossible. Heartbeat. Faint. Ancient. Slow. But undeniably there. She looked over her shoulder. The stranger hadn't moved. She looked down again. There were no words in her mind. No vision. No command. Just certainty. Something beneath this hill was sleeping. Not dead. Not buried. Sleeping. Waiting. Listening to the rain. She placed her palm flat to the soil. The seed in her pocket grew warm. A soft throb, like recognition. And then, behind her, the stranger stirred. Sat up slowly. You hear it too? She nodded without looking up. It's not ready to wake yet, she whispered. But it knows we're here. Does it remember us? He asked. She hesitated. Then said quietly, no. It remembers what we carry. And then, as the mist curled tighter around the hilltop and the grasses bowed low, the seed in her pocket pulsed one more time. Then stilled. As if saying, not yet. But soon. Part 39, The Path That Waits Beneath Feet. By morning, the rain had stopped. But the wetness lingered, thick in the soil, hanging in the branches of the crooked tree, and trailing down her coat in tiny, glistening beads. They stood quietly together at the crest of the hill, neither speaking. The stranger's eyes were on the land below, those far fields, the shadows of other woods, the soft curves where fog gathered and waited like breath held in a dream. But her eyes stayed on the ground. On the spiral still visible in the flattened grasses. And on the earth beneath that spiral, warm, still breathing. It's older than the forest, she said finally. Whatever it is. Whatever sleeps here. He nodded slowly. It let us pass. Let us walk above it. Like it knew. They said no more for a while. The mist thinned. Light filtered in sideways through the clouds, faint and silver, never forming shadows. Then she stepped away from the center of the spiral. Something had settled in her overnight. Not urgency. Not command. Readiness. She reached into her satchel and pulled out the black disc. Its spiral shimmered faintly, more still than before. Resting. Then her hand found the seed. Cool now. No pulse. No signal. Just wait. As if waiting to be placed. But not here. She turned from the hill. It's not our place to wake it, she said. Only to know it's here. So when the time comes, someone can lead the next one back. The stranger took one last look at the earth. Then followed. They descended the hill without fanfare, their boots pressing into the softened soil. With each step away from the sleeping spiral, the air changed again, less heavy, more stretched, as if something had exhaled long behind them. The land before them opened wide. Grasses gave way to stone. Stone gave way to cracked, forgotten paths. Faint signs of where others had once walked, but long ago. No footsteps. Just absence. And far ahead, near the place where the next tree line began, a crooked signpost leaned in the wind. Blank. No carvings. No names. Only age. Only direction. She stopped beside it. The wood was smooth, worn down not by hands or weather, but by time. She placed the disc gently against its surface. And for a moment, the spiral glowed. Not bright. But enough to catch the grain of the wood. Words etched themselves slowly, not by magic, not by tool. But like something remembering how to speak. This way to the place that waits. She stepped back. The glow faded. The words remained. And together, without needing to speak, they followed where the sign now pointed. Toward a path that had always been there. Just waiting. For someone who knew where to look. Part 40, The Keeper's Crossing. The path led them through low, windswept fields, where old stone walls slouched in the grass like forgotten sentences. The ground felt firm beneath their boots, less like the yielding forest floor, more like something made from memory layered over centuries. The path was faint, but it held. Every few steps, they passed a marker, a shard of pottery wedged in a mossy ridge, a single feather caught in a thorn bush, a coin melted flat and sunk into the soil. These weren't signs left for travelers. They were traces of decisions, breadcrumbs laid by those who came before and had turned, paused, or planted something in the world. Each object whispered, not in words, but in weight. The stranger walked slightly ahead, silent, focused. She watched his shoulders. Once hunched, now relaxed. Not careless. Just no longer afraid to be seen by the path. Her hand brushed the satchel at her side. The disc inside remained cool. Quiet. Sleeping, perhaps. Or simply listening. By midday, the fields gave way to a shallow valley where the wind stilled. The silence here was different than in the forest. It didn't press. It invited. At the valley's center, a low wooden structure waited. A bridge. Worn. Unpainted. No river ran beneath it. Only a dry gully, overgrown with ferns and creeping root. But when she stepped near, she understood. It wasn't meant to cross water. It was meant to cross time. She froze. The stranger turned. "What is it?" he asked. She shook her head slowly, eyes fixed on the bridge. "It's not a crossing for bodies," she whispered. "It's a crossing for selves. The kind of bridge you only walk once. The kind that asks for a piece of you in return." She reached into her coat. Not for the disc. Not for the seed. But for something she hadn't touched since the beginning. A scrap of cloth, torn from her old pack. It was frayed. Dark. Stained. Not useful. Except it was. It carried who she had been when she entered the forest. The person who first listened to the rain, sat by the fire, and asked the silence for its stories. She tied the cloth to the railing of the bridge. "I'll leave this," she said. "So I don't carry the same shape across." He nodded. From his own pocket, the stranger pulled a shard of something blackened and rough. Burnt wood, maybe. A fragment from the night he forgot who he was. He laid it on the first plank. "We step forward," he said. "But we don't forget." Then, side by side, they crossed. The air on the far side was lighter. Cooler. And as they passed beyond the final plank, the wind stirred once more. And the bridge behind them creaked. Once. And then was still. Part 41, The Field Where the Sky Bends. The land beyond the bridge was open, so open it made her breath catch. No trees. No hills. Just a great, endless field swaying beneath a sky that seemed lower now, as if bending to meet the earth. The grass here was a silvery green, whispering as it moved. Not rustling, not snapping. Whispering. Like wind through old pages. They walked without speaking. There was no path. But the field accepted them anyway. The grass parted just enough for their feet, then gently closed behind them, leaving no trace, no trail, no line for anyone to follow. This was not a place you could find by returning. Only by continuing. Every few moments, she looked up, not to check the sky for sun or storm, but to feel the sheer presence of it. It hung above like a great mirror turned inward. Not watching from above, but remembering alongside them. "I don't think we're meant to stay here long," the stranger said, his voice soft. "It doesn't feel like a place where things root." She agreed. This was not a forest. Not a hill. Not a crossing. It was a clearing. Of thought. Of burden. Of shape. She stopped. Let the wind pass through her coat. Listen to the hush of the tall grass brushing against her knees. From her satchel, she drew out the black disk. Still cool. Still silent. But when she held it up to the sky, the spiral shimmered faintly, pulsing once. And then... nothing. "It's waiting," she said. "But not for us." The stranger looked over. "Then who?" She didn't answer. Because the answer didn't have words yet. They walked until the grasses thinned and the earth sloped again, downward now, into a soft depression where the wind circled differently. More focused. Like breath held in a deep lung. At the bottom was a pool. Shallow. Still. So clear it reflected not the sky above, but the self standing before it. She knelt at its edge. Looked down. What she saw made her still completely. Not her face. Not as it was. But as it had been. When she first entered the forest. When she first sat beside the fire. When she had listened to the silence with fear, not trust. And slowly, behind that reflection, another appeared. A child. Eyes wide. Holding something heavy. A burden too old for their hands. Then it blinked. And the reflection was hers again. Only now. Her eyes were different. Calmer. Clearer. Wider in a new way. She looked up. The field no longer stretched endlessly. Ahead, a new rise began. Gentle. Subtle. But waiting. A new climb. Another shape. "This isn't the end," she whispered. The stranger, standing beside her, looked down at the water. His reflection, too, had changed. And both of them understood. They had crossed something. Left something. And taken something else into themselves. And whatever waited on the far side of that next hill, the forest's breath would still be with them. Part 42, Where the Ash Trees Grow. The climb was longer than it appeared. Not steep, just steady, endless in its rhythm. Each step took effort not because of weight or wind, but because of the stillness they were leaving behind. The pool, the reflection, the silence, all of it clung gently to the back of their minds as they walked. And yet, the farther they climbed, the more the light began to change. It filtered down from above like smoke through leaves, though there were no trees yet. The very air shimmered faintly, the color of slate warmed by firelight. It felt like walking toward a memory that hadn't happened yet, familiar, but unfinished. Then, without warning, the first tree appeared. It wasn't tall. Nor broad. But its bark was pale and flaking, ash-white, and its leaves hung like quiet thoughts, barely moving in the breeze. More followed. They crested the rise, and before them stood a grove, not dense, not wild, but arranged with strange care. The ash trees stood in loose circles, some close together, some alone. Their trunks twisted skyward in quiet motion, like they were still deciding which way to grow. There was no sound here. Even the wind felt hushed. And yet, it wasn't oppressive. It was listening. The stranger stepped lightly over the roots. "Ash trees don't grow just anywhere," he said softly. "They only root where something's been left behind." She nodded. And then, slowly, she reached into her satchel. The third seed, the one that had followed them from the forest, across the fields, to the hill, and its sleeping heart, was warm again. Alive again. No pulse. No command. Just a quiet readiness. She didn't ask the stranger. Didn't need to. She stepped into the nearest circle of ash trees and knelt in the soft soil. It smelled like fire, old fire, long since cooled. She dug gently with her hands, and the earth welcomed the gesture. No resistance. She placed the seed into the hollow. Not deep. Just enough for it to touch the soil. And then she covered it. Pressed her palms against it. Closed her eyes. She did not speak. She remembered. All of it. The rain. The flame. The silent things that watched. The names she had been given without letters. The spiral she had carried in her chest. And in that stillness, the grove responded. Leaves above trembled, not from wind, but from knowing. And behind her, the stranger whispered. "This is where it begins again." She stood. The seed didn't glow. Didn't bloom. It waited. And that was enough. Whatever it would become would not be for them. But someone would find it. Someone who heard rain in silence. Someone who carried too much. Someone searching for a path that didn't yet have shape. The ash trees would guide them. And she was ready to keep walking. Part 43, Beneath Branches That Remember Rain. They lingered in the grove only a little while longer. Long enough to listen. Long enough to feel the seed settle beneath the soil like a breath exhaled after holding too long. Then the wind shifted. It moved through the ash trees like a voice without words, rustling the high branches, curling around the trunk she had touched. It wasn't a direction. It was a nudge. "It's time," she said softly. The stranger didn't reply, only looked once more at the circle where the seed now lay. His eyes were calm. Grateful. They left the grove by a narrow line between the trees, not a trail but a thinning of the roots, as though the forest itself parted just enough to let them through. The ground beneath their boots turned firmer, less softened by moss, more packed by old footfalls. Signs of others began to return. Not recent, but real. Small cairns of stone nestled in the shade. A strip of fabric tied to a low branch. Scorch marks from a fire long gone. Remnants not of struggle, but of passage. The kind of things left behind when someone learns something, and moves on. As they walked, the trees grew stranger. Wider. Taller. More curved, their trunks bending gently inward as if to whisper across the path. Not menacing, reverent. These weren't just trees. They were witnesses. And beneath them, the forest began to speak again. Not aloud. Not in sound. But in pattern. Each branch above arched toward the next in a spiral. Each fallen leaf settled with its points turned in one direction. Even the knots in the bark swirled inward, echoing the shape she had carried for so long. The spiral. Everywhere. Not forced. Inherent. She slowed her steps. looked down. There, in the trail ahead, a single flat stone had been set into the path. Its surface worn smooth by countless steps. And in its center, carved so shallow it could barely be seen, a spiral. The same size. The same shape. But incomplete. Only half-etched. The stranger crouched beside it, tracing it with one hand. This is where someone once turned back. She knelt beside him. Or where they waited for someone else to finish it. She reached for her satchel. But not for the disc. She took nothing out. Instead, she closed her hand over the spiral and pressed her palm flat to the stone. And there, without spark, without sound, the spiral completed itself. No light. No shift. Just closure. She stood. So did he. And ahead, the path unfolded again, gently winding toward a line of trees darker than the rest, where the wind moved in long, slow waves. The kind of wind that only flows where something old is waking. Part 44, The Trees That Had No Names. The path narrowed as it entered the next stretch of forest. Not because of crowding, there were fewer trees now, but because the space between them held something thick, unseen, and watching. The ground felt colder. The light, thinner. The silence, heavier. The trunks of these trees were taller than any they had seen before. They stretched up into mist so dense their tops were hidden completely, as though the sky had been swallowed. Their bark was blackened, not by fire, but by age, veined with silver-gray lines like cracks in ancient stone. And none of them bore carvings. No spiral. No name. No memory left behind. Why does it feel like they're waiting for something? The stranger asked. She didn't answer at first. Because she was watching the forest watch them. The disc in her satchel warmed faintly. Just enough to let her know, these trees knew. Not her name, not her path, but what she carried. They didn't speak, didn't shift, didn't bend. But they recognized. Not waiting, she said softly. Remembering. The deeper they walked, the darker the bark became, until some trees looked like silhouettes carved from shadow. But there were no threats here. No malice. Only gravity. The air pulled inward. Every breath felt drawn from a deeper well. And under her boots, the soil changed, no longer soft with rot or moss, but packed with fine dust, pale gray and ancient. Then, in a small clearing, they found something that stopped them both. A monolith. Not stone. Wood. But shaped. Tall and smooth, like a tree stripped bare and carved by wind. It had no markings. Just faint swirls in the grain, natural, but unmistakably patterned. A spiral again. But this one ran upward, coiling around the trunk toward a place unseen. She reached out and touched it. Cold. Solid. And, somehow, listening. The stranger placed his hand beside hers. We're not the first ones to come here, he said. But I think we're the first ones who came back. The trees around them didn't move. But the wind that passed between them changed. Not in direction. In tone. Lower. Older. Like breath from something buried beneath roots too deep to ever unearth. The disc in her satchel pulsed once. And she understood. There's something below, she whispered. Not sleeping. Not dead. Kept. They stood in silence, surrounded by the trees with no names. And far beneath their feet, something began to turn. Slowly. Steadily. A spiral, deep in the dark. Not awakening. Not yet. But, remembering. Part 45, The Spiral That Turns Beneath. They stood in the clearing, still as stones. The air had thickened, not with fear, but with the density of presence. Something far below them was moving, but not like footsteps or tremors. It was slow, circular, like a deep mechanism just beginning to turn for the first time in centuries. Not loud. Not violent. A spiral. The stranger stepped back from the monolith, his face pale but calm. "It doesn't want us to leave," he said. "Not yet." She felt it too. The forest no longer asked questions. It listened. Held. And something within it had turned its eye upward, not hostile, not summoning, just aware. She knelt and placed her palm against the forest floor. It felt hollow. Not empty, just vast beneath the surface, like the ground here was stretched across the lid of a chamber that hadn't been opened in ages. She pulled out the disc. Its spiral was no longer swirling. It had stopped. Perfectly still. And instead of light, the center had gone completely black. Not unlit. Not dull. Just quiet. Then the spiral began to turn again, backwards. A slow reversal. The wind passed through the clearing, bending the grass low. The trees did not move, but their trunks hummed faintly, like great tuning forks. The stranger knelt beside her. His voice was low. "I think we're standing on the memory of a question. One no one's ever answered." She looked at him. Or one that was asked too soon. A soft sound rose from beneath the earth. Not a voice. Not a growl. A chime. Low. Long. Lonely. The disc in her hands grew warm. And then, without her touch, it lifted slightly. Only an inch, maybe two. Floating in the air above her palms, turning slowly, casting a pale circle of shifting shadow onto the ground. It wasn't glowing. It was revealing. As the disc turned, the dirt beneath it rippled. Then, in complete silence, a ring of small wooden posts rose from the ground in a perfect spiral around them. 13 markers. No taller than her knee. Each one smooth, dark, unmarked. But she knew what they were. Questions. Not doors. Not keys. Each one a piece of something left behind by someone who had almost understood. She stood slowly. "It's not showing us where to go," she said. "It's showing us what was forgotten." The stranger turned, taking in the spiral of posts. "You think it wants us to remember them?" She shook her head. "No. It wants us to carry them forward." The forest groaned. Not in pain. But in effort, like something long dormant was shifting its weight again. The spiral below turned. And far away, so far it could have been inside or outside or beyond. A second chime sounded. Higher. Brighter. An answer. The stranger looked up at the sky, then back at her. "We've passed through. But now we have to go back. Not to the same path. To where the path had once begun. To make it complete." She nodded, fingers curling once more around the disc. The forest had remembered. Now it was their turn. Part 46, The Turning of the First Silence. They began the descent at dusk. The light here did not fade like it had in other parts of the forest. Instead, it folded in on itself, like the closing of a book, or the moment between two thoughts. A hush fell across the grove, and with it came a stillness deeper than quiet. The spiral of posts remained behind them, embedded in the soil like a question asked in the old tongue. The disc, now cool again, rested in her hand with the stillness of something that had fulfilled one purpose and awaited another. They walked. Not along a path. Not through clearing or trail. But between. The trees watched, tall and uncarved, no spirals in their bark. But she could feel them listening. Not to her movements, but to the sound of what she carried now, not just the disc, or the name, or the memory, but the echo of what had slept beneath the hill. The stranger walked beside her. He didn't speak. Neither did she. Because the silence now was not emptiness. It was a kind of language. A language spoken by roots and rain. By ash bark and spirals carved in stone. By the space between waking and sleep, and by the stillness of things too old to die. And soon, that silence began to change. Subtle at first, a shift in scent. Earth giving way to moss. Dampness sharpening around the edges. Then came the sound. Rain. Soft. Familiar. Falling on leaves overhead that hadn't been there moments ago. The forest had brought them back. Or maybe they had brought the forest with them. The trees here were familiar now. Not identical, but shaped like memory. The crooked branches, the glint of fire-warmed bark, the soft rise of earth where something had once been buried. She stopped. Ahead, barely visible through the silver mist, stood a fire ring of old stones. Her fire. From the beginning. Still there. Still waiting. And beside it, half covered in lichen, soaked through with time, the first object she had left behind. A torn scrap of cloth, once used to bind a wound. The stranger stepped past her, knelt, and placed his palm on one of the stones. "We've come full circle," he said. She stepped beside him. "No," she whispered. "The circle came with us." And as the rain fell, and the mist moved, and the old silence wrapped itself gently around them once more, the spiral in her hand glowed faintly. Not with heat. Not with warning. But with welcome. She sat beside the fire ring. The stranger sat beside her. And for the first time in a long time, they did not plan their next step. Because something new was growing now. And it would bloom in its own time. Part 47, The Name That Waited in the Rain. The fire ring was wet, but she didn't try to light anything. There was no need. The warmth now came from somewhere deeper, beneath the skin, behind the ribs. The kind of warmth that didn't flicker or die with the wind, but lingered like the last glow in burned-out coals. She sat in silence. The rain slid down her sleeves. Tapped gently on the crown of her hood. Formed slow drips from the branches above. She remembered the first night she had sat here. How uncertain she had been. How she had pressed close to the fire, clutching her knees, watching shadows shift behind every tree. How the disk had pulsed without pattern. How she thought the silence meant she was alone. Now she knew better. The silence had never been empty. It had simply been waiting for her to learn its voice. The stranger stirred beside her, breaking a long stretch of quiet. "Do you remember what you called yourself, before the forest?" She thought for a long while. Then said, without turning, "I remember the shape of it. But not the sound. You want it back." She looked at the disk in her lap. The spiral swirled gently now, no glow, no pull. Just motion, steady and calm. No, she said. It wasn't the wrong name. Just, the first one. This one's quieter. And I can carry it further. He nodded. She could feel the motion beside her. Then I'll call you what the rain does, he said. A listener. She smiled faintly. Let the rain drip from her chin, cold and soft. And finally, she asked the question that had sat in her chest since the spiral beneath the hill began to turn. Do you think this place is where the forest ends? He paused, then leaned back on his hands and looked up. No, he said. I think it's where it starts over. She lay back in the moss, staring up into the web of branches above. The rain fell in slow rhythms now, as if it knew they had nowhere else to be. She listened to the quiet, to the spiral's hum, to the forest's breath. And slowly, her own name, not the old one, not the first one, but the true one, rose up through her. Not in sound, not in words, but in feeling. And the forest, at last, whispered it back. Part 48, The Memory That Was Never Written. Dawn came without light. The forest remained draped in mist, and the rain softened into something more like breath than weather. It didn't fall anymore, it rested, suspended in the air like sleep too deep to stir. She rose quietly, brushing damp moss from her coat. The stranger was still seated near the fire ring, eyes closed, face tilted toward the branches above. There was no rush now. But the spiral in her hand turned with gentle purpose. Not fast. Not slow. But forward. She understood. There was still one thing left to do. Not a task. A gift. She walked away from the ring, deeper into the trees. Not far, just far enough that the hush shifted slightly, and the branches bent a little closer together. Here, the forest remembered differently. Not names. Not places. But choices. And hanging from one of the branches, nearly lost in the folds of bark and lichen, was a ribbon of black cloth. She hadn't put it there. But she remembered it. It was tied in the way her mother had once shown her, looped 3 times, twisted at the center, sealed by a knot made without pulling tight. A knot meant for holding, not for binding. She took it down gently. Unwound it. And in that moment, memory didn't return, it arrived. Whole. Unbroken. Carried to her not as thought, but as presence. A time before the forest. A night by a different fire. A promise whispered into sleep. Even if you forget me, I'll find you again. Her hands trembled. Not from cold, but from recognition. She tied the ribbon once more, but this time around the spiral disc in her palm. Not to hide it. To honor it. To carry what had never been written, but had always been known. She turned back through the trees, finding her way not by sight, but by feel. And when she stepped once more into the clearing, the stranger looked up. No words passed between them. Because some names don't need to be spoken. Some truths don't need to be told. They're carried. She placed the disc in the fire ring. It didn't sink. Didn't vanish. It simply sat there, silent and waiting. And slowly, around it, the stones began to warm. One by one, tiny sprouts of green pushed up between the cracks. Not flowers. Not flame. New growth. A spiral, unfolding from the center. And she understood then. She wasn't leaving the forest. She was becoming part of it. Part 49, the fire that needed no flame. They didn't light the fire. But somehow, it burned. Not with heat. Not with smoke. But with presence, soft, slow light that rose from the center of the ring like breath made visible. It pulsed from the disk, coiled with the ribbon tied round it, and gently filled the clearing with a glow that wasn't quite color. It cast no shadows. It didn't flicker. It simply was. She sat beside it again, not to warm herself, but to remember. Not her past, but all the paths. Every trail. Every rain-drenched stone. Every pause beneath the canopy where silence asked her a question she didn't know she'd been answering. The spiral had never led her outward. It had always been leading her in. And now, at the center of all she had seen, carried, and changed, was this. The stranger sat beside her once more, his coat soaked, his boots muddy, his eyes at peace. "We'll leave this here," she said, not turning. "Someone else will need it. Maybe years from now. Maybe tomorrow." He nodded. "And they'll know it's safe. Because we stayed." The spiral in the center of the fire ring turned one last time. Just once. And then it stopped. Not in loss. Not in finality. In arrival. Rain tapped softly on the leaves above. It no longer felt cold. It felt like a hand pressed gently to the back of her neck. A reminder. A blessing. A naming. Not of who she had been, but of who she had become. Listener. Carrier. Keeper of the quiet spiral. She looked out past the clearing. The path still waited. Not behind. Ahead. And though the forest had grown familiar, she knew, there were still woods she hadn't entered, names she hadn't met, fires she hadn't sat beside. She rose. So did he. They didn't take the disc. They left it where it belonged. The fire that wasn't fire still glowed gently behind them, a warm mark on a world too often hidden in the dark. And the spiral now lay open for the next to step within. Part 50, the path that never ends. They walked without looking back. Not because what they left behind wasn't important, but because it was. It would hold. It would wait. And when the next weary soul stepped into the clearing, guided by storm or silence, they would know. Someone had come before. Someone had listened. And someone had left the way open. The forest parted gently as they moved forward. The rain still fell, soft and even. No wind. No thunder. Just that steady breath of the world, exhaling through every leaf and root. The stranger walked beside her. Quiet. Steady. There was no destination now. Not really. Only motion. Only the way forward. She no longer carried the disc. She no longer needed to. The spiral was in her now. In the way she stepped lightly between mossy stones. In the way she heard every rhythm in the trees. In the way she felt no fear when the silence deepened. Because silence was never empty. They passed through a final grove. Smaller trees here. Younger. Still learning the shape of the sky. And there, between two narrow trunks, the forest opened, not with grandeur, not with light, but with invitation. Beyond the trees, a field. Beyond the field, nothing she recognized. Which meant it was right. She turned to the stranger. "This is where I go on," she said. Without you. His eyes were calm. It always was. But you'll still walk. He smiled. Always. Someone will need the path behind you tended. They embraced. Not tightly. Just enough. And then she stepped into the field. The mist curled around her legs. The rain pressed gently against her back. The spiral in her chest turned slowly, steadily, toward the next fire, the next clearing, the next name. And behind her, the forest breathed. Alive. Endless. Waiting. For the next footfall. The next story. The next quiet question whispered beneath the canopy. And somewhere far ahead, another spiral began to turn.